Honorable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our King, to his government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interest and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Amen. It being Thursday, we will now be led in the singing of God Save the King by Sydney Manning.
God save our gracious King, long live our noble King. God save the King. Send him victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the King.
Please be seated.
Introduction of visitors.
It's my absolute pleasure to introduce to all members of the Assembly a couple of visitors from the outstanding constituency of Old Stittsbury Three Hills. Miss Laura Lee Cunningham and Carrie Forbes are both councillors from Kneehill County. They were attending the RMA's Fall Convention. I ask them to please rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly. It's also my pleasure to introduce a friend to many around this chamber and former colleague to many of us as well, Miss Miranda Rosen. Miss Rosen was the 936th member to serve this Assembly. She was the member for Banff, Kananaskis from 2019 to 2023. During her time, she served as the Parliamentary Secretary for Tourism. Please rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Introduction of guests.
Honourable members, it's my pleasure to introduce today's anthem singer, Sydney Manning. Sydney has been singing for over 5 decades. During that time, he sang with the Alberta Honour Choir and various church choirs. When he isn't singing, Sydney is a provincial administrator for plumbing and gas for Alberta's municipal affairs. Please rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly. The Honourable Member for Leduc Beaumont has a school group.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to introduce grade 6 students from the Father Leduc Catholic School in Leduc. I got a chance to meet the students and take some pictures earlier. They were very excited to be here, and we're excited to welcome them. Please rise and accept the warm welcome of the House.
The Honourable Member for Camrose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Camrose has a school group.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everyone wants to be from Camrose. It's my pleasure to stand up and introduce to you and through you the Holden Academy Grade 9 class. Will you please stand and receive the traditional warm welcome of this chamber?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance, the President of Treasury Board has a school group.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't get to do this often because we're too far from Edmonton, but I'm very pleased to introduce students from the Erskine School, grades 7 to 9. Please stand and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Bular McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to introduce 3 guests from Calgary, Asad Khan Shahzada, Ashtar Khan, and Sher Akbar Khan. They are executives of ANP Calgary Chapter, a movement inspired by Bacha Khan's vision of nonviolence and pacifism. They organize cultural events, support humanitarian causes, and provide valuable services to the community. I ask them to rise and receive the traditional warm welcome.
The Honourable Member for Seniors, Community and Social Services.
To rise and introduce to you and all members of the Assembly, Missy Griffiths, who's the Executive Director of FCSS in Rimbey. Her son Tanner is with her, as well as my dear friends, councillors from Clearwater County, Jenny Melhoff and Neil Ratcliffe. I'd ask that all of them stand up and receive the traditional warm welcome of this Assembly.
Minister of Immigration and Multiculturalism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to rise today and introduce to you and through you to the entire Assembly Mr. Syed Najam Hassan, a great philanthropist and pastor Albertan, along with his relatives, Ifat, Iman, Imad, and Salar Khan. The founder and the president of Love with the Humanity Association, Syed Najam, and his team has established 44 portable community libraries, 15 portable community food banks, several clothing and pet food banks, delivered 3,000 food hampers. Please rise and receive
the honourable member for Edmonton Southwest.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to introduce to you and through you a dear childhood friend and former resident of Edmonton Southwest, Mr. Clayton Wong, along with his family, wife Ruth Wong, daughter Haley Wong, and son James Wong. Please rise and receive the traditional warm welcome of this Assembly.
The honourable member for Edmonton Castle Downs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise and introduce to you and through you my incredible office manager, Joe Hall, 3 social work students from MacEwan University. They are Connor McNally, Zach Fajedo, and Noah Mascarenes. If they could please rise and receive the traditional warm welcome of this Assembly.
The Honourable the Government House Leader has an introduction.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise and introduce to you and through you and to all members of the Assembly, Darren Reeder, the CEO and President of the Tourism Industry Association of Alberta, and Rachel Ludwig, CEO of Tourism Canmore Kananaskis. And while I'm on my feet, another friend of tourism, a good friend of the gallery, Miranda Rosen.
The Honourable Minister of Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce to you and through you and to all members of the Assembly 4 members of the tremendous county of Wetaskiwin, Assistant CEO Jeff Chipley, Reeve Josh Bishop, Deputy Reeve Kathy Royakers, and Councillor Bill Cron. May you please rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
The Honourable Member for Banff, Kananaskis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of my colleague, the member of Banff Kananaskis, I introduce to you and through you 4 committed constituents from Bow Valley Pride, Ron Laverne, Sarah Jackson, Finn Saint-Denis, and Carly Moore. We're honoured to have you here for another day. Please rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Are there others? Seeing none.
Ministerial statements. Member statements.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Castle Downs has a statement to make.
For more than 100 years, Canadians have gathered to remember the countless sacrifices of the people who serve our country during times of war, conflict, and peace. We honour the soldiers, the nurses, and the many others who sacrifice so much to protect the freedoms that we enjoy today. We gather on November 11th to show our gratitude for the sacrifices made and to demonstrate that the loss of our Canadian soldiers was not in vain, but in pursuit of peace, freedom, and democracy. During this week of remembrance, it's important that we recognize that our safety and security is made possible by countless Canadians who defend our borders at home and abroad. Our veterans fought in support of freedom, democracy, rule of law, and human rights. As war, conflict, and extreme violence continue with our global community, let Remembrance Day be a reminder to center these values. The commitment of our military has earned Canada a worldwide reputation as a country that supports and protects peace. And over the last century, millions of Canadians have proudly served our country in uniform, not only contributing internationally, but fulfilling important roles on home soil, including their service on search and rescue missions and response to natural disasters, such as helping with wildfire efforts in Jasper. Mr. Speaker, our remembrance should not be limited to a single day. We reap the benefits of our soldiers' sacrifices every day and should not take them for granted. So as Canadians, let us honour those who fought for us and continue to fight for us and the values that we hold so dear. Let us pay tribute to the soldiers who sacrificed their lives for us, those who have served, those currently serving both at home and abroad, and to the families and friends that support our military community to do the selfless work that they do every day for all of us, lest we forget.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Lougheed.
Mr. Speaker, Alberta's Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act was enacted before the commercialization of the Internet. Because it predates modern technology, it does not currently account for an increasingly digital environment or for the sheer volume and complexity of records that are being managed by public bodies to provide services to Albertans. Mr. Speaker, we increasingly rely on technology and digital platforms in our everyday lives, whether we're shopping online, opening a bank account, or applying for a job. Alberta's government is proposing to divide the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act into two acts, one focused on access to information and the other focused on privacy. Separating the act will help ensure access to information and privacy each receive the dedicated attention they deserve. The new Access to Information Act would bring Alberta in line with the other jurisdictions which have all updated their legislation and align with the Supreme Court of Canada decision that affirmed that cabinet confidentiality is essential to good government. Changes to access to information laws would modernize the language used to refer to access to information and streamline processes to provide Albertans with faster, concrete response times for access to information requests. Mr. Speaker, the FOIP Act came into force in 1995 and has not been updated in the last 29 years. As the world has continued to evolve, our legislation has not. We have heard from Albertans that updating our access to information and privacy legislation is long overdue. The new Act would allow public bodies to proactively disclose information, making it easier for Albertans to receive more information from government and other public bodies. It would also help better define cabinet confidentiality in the same way other Canadian jurisdictions have, and streamline processes in a way that allows government officials to focus on good governments. Thank you.
The honourable member for Edmonton Rutherford has a statement to make.
Mr. Speaker, commemorating those who served, those serving now, and those about to serve is more than a gesture. It's an expression of gratitude to those who paid the highest price in pursuit of peace, freedom, and progress. I would especially like to acknowledge the veterans who are still with us today. You all know intimately the challenge of serving your country, the preparation, the training, and the sacrifice away from your families and your nations. It is an extraordinary commitment, and for that we are all deeply grateful. We gathered today adorned with poppies made of cotton or beads to honour the contribution of over 1 million Canadians from all walks of life, background and race, and have made and continue to make lasting contributions during time of war, conflict, or peace, including the enlistment of over 12,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, a shining example of honouring the relationship of peace and friendship between Indigenous peoples and this country. You see, a nation's military is not just for defense or foreign relations, but certainly in times of crisis, their deployment saves lives at home and abroad. Way up in the north, the Canadian Armed Forces ensure that Arctic airspace is respected or food and the necessities of life reach our most northern residents. During times of intense wildfire or the global pandemic, we call upon our armed forces to build hospitals, deliver supplies, and respond to disasters beyond the scope and scale even our first responders could imagine. It is for these reasons we remember all service members who have received the call to risk life and limb to save their country, because today is also a day to mourn the loss of those who paid the ultimate price, those who never came home. May we forever preserve their memory, lest we forget. Hai hai nanaskamon.
The honourable member for Cypress Medicine Hat has a statement to make.
Mr. Speaker, Monday is Remembrance Day, a time for somber reflection. It is a reminder of the sacrifices made by Canadians who fought for our freedoms and security. It is a time to reflect upon those who faced unimaginable horrors on the battlefield, standing resolute in the face of danger. These brave men and women have dedicated their lives to serving our country while facing the horrors of war with unwavering determination, all while ensuring the protections and freedoms for generations to come. My constituency is home to the South Alberta Light Horse, a reserve unit. As a reserve unit, they both serve our country as well as our community. Their tireless efforts demonstrate the vital partnerships between our military and the communities they serve in, all while cultivating resilience and unity. They also remind us how close to home our protection is, and how many of those who serve in our military serve right in our own neighbourhoods. To our Canadian Armed Forces members, veterans, and their families, thank you. Your sacrifice bravery, and commitment are the backbone to our nation's freedom. It is the dedication of our veterans that serve as inspiration for future generations, exemplifying the strong culture and strength of Alberta and Canada. We will not take our freedoms for granted, Mr. Speaker. We will always honour the men and women who have served and continue to serve our country, and we will support and protect them just as they have protected us. We will always acknowledge the profound loss that families and friends have endured of the fallen, and we will always remember the sacrifices made by so many so that freedom can exist for all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, our veterans are not merely heroes in uniform. They're the embodiment of resilience and courage. Each poppy we wear symbolizes a life given, a story untold, and a legacy left behind, lest we forget.
The honourable member for Calgary Elbow.
It's Hindu Heritage Month, Mr. Speaker, a month to recognize the contributions of the Hindu community to Calgary, to Canada and Alberta. I am Hindu. My father arrived in Edmonton in 1967 to study engineering. My mother followed in 1969. My parents thrived here in a land of freedom. My dad told me, I can make an honest living here without paying off some politician for favors. He's very clear that freedom, democracy, justice, and prosperity go hand in hand and can only exist in a society without corruption. As a Hindu, I want the same thing other Canadians want from life: health, a roof over my head, food on the table, a little extra for a vacation, and safety and security. Certainly, Hindus are unfortunately feeling unsafe in their places of worship right now, in the wake of the unrest in Brampton over the week. People I've talked to in the Hindu community are committed to maintaining and growing their relationship with other communities, but the fear is present. I hope that the Brampton episode is investigated and the perpetrators brought to justice. The essence of Hinduism is pluralism. Rig Veda states, let noble thoughts come to us from all sides, Mr. Speaker. And I believe this history and reality of accepting different points of view will help the Hindu community move forward, as long as we're safe and our safety is taken seriously. That pluralism, of course, manifests itself in different ways of living life. Hinduism, in its massive corpus of literature, the scripture includes transgender heroes in some of its earliest works, going back 2,500 years. Trans people have always been with us. The Mahabharata includes this couplet: what is here is found elsewhere, what is not here is nowhere. Now, I see this as aspirational rather than definitive. Clearly, quantum mechanics is not in the Mahabharata. But its purpose was to document the entire totality of human experience, and transgender people are a part of that. It makes me proud to be Hindu and live a life of love for all.
The honourable member for Edmonton City Centre.
Mr. Speaker, every Albertan from Lethbridge to Lacrete deserves to feel safe and welcome in their community. But after 5 years under the UCP, they don't. 60% of Albertans feel crime is getting worse where they live. 2/3 of women don't feel safe in their neighbourhood. Nearly 1 in 4 Albertans have been a victim of crime, and 50% fear they'll be next. That's on the UCP. Ask Albertans what they think is making our communities less safe. They'll tell you. Issues with addictions and mental health, inadequate court systems, poverty and inequality, a bad economy and unemployment, all issues that are the responsibility of this government. Under the UCP, deaths from drug poisonings have hit record highs. Public drug use has soared. We have the second highest rate of unemployment in Canada, highest for insurance, third highest for utilities, and the lowest minimum wage. Across the province, the number of people living without housing is soaring. Courts are so backlogged and overwhelmed that judges are warning serious criminal cases could be dropped. The UCP have slashed, slowed, and pulled back funding for crucial programs and services, from income support to affordable housing to women's shelters to community-led programs for family and youth in need, and that's left Albertans less safe. Albertans are clear. They want a government that will take real action to help those in need, address root causes so police can focus on actual crime, a government that funds our courts so they can function efficiently and support justice, a government that actually does the work to bring costs down and wages up so Albertans can get ahead. And after 5 years, we can see that's not the UCP. Mr. Speaker, it's clear this government has no plan to make Albertans' lives better, to build safety in our communities. But while the UCP focus on sitting in skyboxes, chasing conspiracies, the Premier's pet political political projects. Alberta's New Democrats and our leader Naheed Nenshi, while we're in the community, actually listening to, talking to, working with Albertans. And unlike this government, we have a plan to undo their damage, rebuild safety. With the Alberta New Democrats, better is possible, and it's coming.
Honourable members, you may notice another new face at the table today. Mr. Aaron Roth will be spending some time in the chamber learning duties of a table officer this fall. Although new to the table, Aaron has been with the Legislative Assembly office for many years, and many of you will already know him. Aaron began his work in House Services as a committee clerk in 2016. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Lethbridge, a Master of Arts degree from the University of Alberta, and has a Master's of Theological Studies degree from Newman Theological College. Please join me in welcoming Aaron to the table. Honourable members, the time is now 1:50, and that makes it oral question period. And the Leader of His Majesty's Loyal Opposition has question 1.
Mr. Speaker, the UCP's new legislation mucks about with the rules that govern how the next Electoral Boundaries Commission will make their decisions when redrawing Alberta's provincial constituencies. The UCP have removed what used to be a mandatory requirement that the Commission should consider municipal boundaries as they draw the lines between ridings. This is an effort by the UCP to further reduce the voices of those who live in municipalities from being heard in this Assembly. What possible excuse is there for the government removing municipal boundaries from mandatory consideration of the new constituency lines?
The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member would be better served to approach this in a more positive way. This is about flexibility. This is about enabling the Commission to be able to conduct its work with as many tools available as possible. Mr. Speaker, this is not foreign language. This is not new language. Other jurisdictions have adopted this language. The courts have provided us with direction. We're simply applying what we've learned from the jurisprudence and from other jurisdictions.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister seems to be projecting nothing to see here, but there is nothing more important than the change they are making. The Electoral Commission is already considering population, geographics, the need for clear boundaries in how they draw up the lines. The only reason the UCP want to change this is to break apart communities and create riding maps that they see as more politically advantageous for themselves. Albertans have not called for this change, and the UCP never campaigned on it. So why are the UCP breaking long-standing practice of constituency seats respecting municipal borders?
The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we're living in 2024, not in 1974. The communities all across this province have become so closely connected through virtual and transportation means, many other ways that communities share unique and common experiences. We're allowing the Commission to use all of the tools available to it, tools that are already in place in many other provinces, many other areas, and come up with the best possible electoral boundary redraws that they can.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
We know the UCP are worried. They lost the popular vote in Calgary. They got completely wiped out in Edmonton. We know there are UCP members who love how Republican-style gerrymandered districts work for politicians and not the people, but Albertans don't want that. Municipalities like Red Deer, Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, Grand Prairie, and Fort McMurray deserve to have fair representation. Will the Premier assure Albertans that her hand-picked members of the next Boundary Commission will not break apart ridings just for the sake of their political gain?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, trust the process, respect the process. The NDP can continue to disparage and speculate on an independent commission that's going to do good work in this province. We prefer to take a positive approach, Mr. Speaker. Our province has grown in unprecedented ways over the past year. In fact, 204,000 people have moved to this great province under the leadership of this great government, Mr. Speaker. That never would have happened if the NDP were in power, and hopefully it'll never happen again.
Right. The honourable member for Edmonton Whitemud has the next question.
Mr. Speaker, the new president-elect of the United States has said he will introduce new tariffs on global imports. With the U.S. accounting for 82% of Alberta's exports last year, tariffs would pose a significant risk to many Alberta industries, particularly energy and agriculture. Alberta will need a clear, action-oriented plan to secure and expand our market access. We will have to work collaboratively with other provinces and the federal government. What is the Premier doing to support a Team Canada approach to secure Alberta's economic future?
The Honourable the Deputy Premier has risen.
Mr. Speaker, thank the member for the question, and thank the member for recognizing there is a new government in the United States right now. With any new government, we're going to work with them to do whatever's in the best interest of the people of Alberta. We're going to be working with the Canadian government. We'll be working with all provincial partners here to do whatever's in the best interest for not just Canada, but of course the province of Alberta.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud.
Alberta's agriculture industry is critical to both our economy and our communities, and Alberta farmers rely heavily on access to the U.S. market. With the potential for new tariffs on imports, Alberta's agriculture sector faces an incredibly uncertain future. Can the Premier tell us how our government is working with the federal government and our industry partners to secure fair access for our farmers in the U.S.? What specific assurances can she offer today to Alberta's agriculture producers?
The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture and Irrigation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, there is going to be a new administration down in the United States. I look forward to bringing forward Alberta's value proposition on agriculture. We know that when there's free-flowing trade in agriculture that doesn't have tariffs burdening it, it's better for food affordability and food security. We are stronger together as two nations. So I look forward to getting down to the U.S. at any opportunity possible, working with this government and this Premier to be able to communicate with this new President-elect, and be able to talk to him about how we're stronger together and we can combat food affordability.
The Honourable Member.
The incoming U.S. President's stance on immediately deporting undocumented migrants will inevitably result in more people seeking asylum in Canada. This has direct implications for our province, particularly along unsecured border points in southern Alberta. Has the Premier made any preparations or held any conversations with federal or other governments to prepare Alberta for an influx of asylum seekers, particularly given the strain it could already place on already stretched thin provincial infrastructure and services?
The Honourable the Minister of Immigration and Multiculturalism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the member for the question. We continue to work with the federal government on asylum seekers and other immigration issues here within Canada, and we have been working on this for federal government, and we want to make sure that anybody who comes to Alberta, whether they're asylum seekers or otherwise, with the package that comes, health package that comes with from the federal government as well.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora has a question to ask.
When speaking to rural municipalities, our leader, Nahad Nenshi, asked delegates if they had to drive at least an hour to get to a hospital. About a third of the folks in the room said yes. When you or someone you love is sick or dying, every minute matters. Far too often, Albertans arrive at the emergency department outside of Edmonton and Calgary and find a sign telling them it's closed and to travel even further. Will the minister tell this Assembly how many hours emergency departments in Alberta were closed last year?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is certainly the reason why we are continuing to work with our rural communities and make sure that we have a rural health strategy. Mr. Speaker, I find it ironic that the members opposite are so concerned about rural health. They didn't care about it before. In fact, Mr. Speaker, they took the Red Deer Hospital, which is a urban community but still has a catchment area of rural communities. They took it off the capital plan, Mr. Speaker. I find it ironic now that they're talking about rural health.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora.
I'll put my record up on public health care against the minister any day, Mr. Speaker. It was 38,000
The honourable member for Edmonton Glenora.
Mr. Speaker. Probably it'll be higher this year. Every week, this last week, Fairview, Lac La Biche, emergency departments were closed multiple days, 38,000 hours, and rural MLAs shouldn't be laughing at that. They shouldn't be proud of it. Rural MLAs should be standing up for their constituents, and they should be making sure that they have access to health care. So why is the minister sitting there and on her hands instead of signing the contract that she negotiated with doctors and already promised she would sign months ago?
Point of order is noted at 2 o'clock from the government House Leader, followed by a point of order at 2 o'clock from the Official Opposition Deputy House Leader. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite wants to put her record up against mine already. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to do that. Let's take a walk down memory lane. Under her leadership as Health Minister, wait times for cataract, hip replacement, and knee replacement surgery all rose by 30% or more. Cataract surgery wait time soared from 10.6 weeks to 16.9 weeks. Mr. Speaker, as of August of 2024, the current wait time for cataract surgery is 12 weeks, way below the members opposite. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to put my record up against hers.
The honourable member for Edmonton Glenora.
And every major municipality in Alberta, you could get a family doctor when I was a minister, and that's certainly not the case today. Nearly 1 million Albertans don't have access to a family doctor, and this Premier and Minister promised that they'd focus on health care. People thought that meant what they would improve morale, that they'd hire more staff, but it's been 177 days, Mr. Speaker, since the Premier went to doctors and promised she would sign the new contract. What's happening? Closed emergency departments. Nearly 1 million Albertans without a family doctor, 20,000 in Lethbridge alone, Mr. Speaker. So, to the Premier, is she going to keep her word and sign that contract? Is it that she didn't mean it, or is it that she can't convince her cabinet?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, everyone could find a family doctor because they drove out hundreds of thousands of people out of Alberta, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, under her record, hip replacement weights increased from 13.1 weeks to 18.9 weeks, and knee replacements rose from 14.7 weeks to 19.1 weeks. As of August of 2024, the average wait time for a hip replacement is 15.9 weeks, much lower than the 18.9 under her watch. And 18.3 weeks for knee surgeries, lower than under her watch. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to put my record up.
The order. The honourable member for Calgary Foothills.
Thank you. Bill 32 creates a floor for the indexation of tax brackets. The legislation decouples indexation from inflation, and when inflation rises, the floor becomes the default. Let's be clear, this is de-indexation. And the last time the UCP did this, it cost Alberta families $650 million. We are in an affordability crisis, Mr. Speaker, and yet this government brought in legislation to take money out of Albertans' pockets. Why is the Premier focused on chemtrails instead of affordability?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance, the President of Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, we certainly aren't de-indexing anything. The changes that we've made, that we will make in Bill 32, are about standardizing rates across government programs. As the Premier said, we had different rates, different calendar year, fiscal year dates, January, June, fall, and she found it indefensible that a program could increase at a different rate than another. We're certainly not doing what the member opposite just said. 2% is the rate for 2025, closely aligns with September over September inflation for Alberta.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Foothills.
Conveniently yesterday it was the rate of inflation, not over the last 5 years. Bill 32 creates a floor for the indexation of AISH, income supports and seniors benefits. Hundreds of thousands of Albertans who struggle to pay rent and buy groceries will suffer higher expenses and lower incomes because of this de-indexation. Why is this government so focused on conspiracies instead of helping Albertans deal with the affordability crisis?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I can see the members opposite or any member in this House being concerned if we would have set a ceiling, but that's not what we did. We set a floor. Either 2%, which is the target rate for the Bank of Canada, or Alberta's CPI. and then Treasury Board and government has the discretion to make it what it needs to be for that year and ensure that it's standardized across government. This is a good news story with about a $200 million cost to government that we're proud to hold that commitment for our programs and for Alberta taxpayers.
The honourable member.
Well, this government promised to decouple the budget from the roller coaster of oil prices. All they have done is decouple themselves from the reality faced by everyday Albertans. Inflation might be 2% today, but it has averaged 3.28% since this government came to power in 2019, the highest in the country. The Premier has already admitted she's having trouble balancing the budget due to their poor financial planning. So why is the path to balance through the pocketbooks of Albertans by taking their money without them knowing about it through this de-indexation legislation?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, this is about standardizing rates across government, as I already said. I like how he mentioned the roller coaster ride of oil. We're in a unique position in this year. We're still in a very strong position. I'll be happy to update Alberta in the end of November for our second quarter. But budget 2025, everyone can see the forecast for oil that's upcoming. There's a lot of pressure down with all of our forecasters. I think Scotiabank came in at $66 for 2025. And even with that coming towards us, we're still committed to indexing in Alberta.
The honourable member for Edmonton South has a question to ask.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I asked about Alberta having the second highest jobless rate in Canada and what the UCP government plans to do to make sure that Albertans have good paying jobs. The minister replied, things are looking, quote, not too shabby. Mr. Speaker, Alberta has one of the highest unemployment rates at 7.7%, and we have now one of the lowest minimum wages in the country. Can the minister please enlighten me, how is it that Albertans are struggling in this current economic climate and things are looking not too shabby?
The Honourable the Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, our government recognizes the demands Albertans are facing, especially with high inflation and elevated interest rates. The average minimum wage across Canada right now is $15.80, and in Alberta, 94% of workers earn more than minimum wage. Over the last 5 years, the number of Albertans earning minimum wage has dropped by 53%. So from 270,000 in 2018 to 126,000 in 2023. So changes to the minimum wage, they can impact small business, youth, and part-time workers, and we're committed to thoughtful review.
The honourable member for Edmonton South.
Given that Alberta hasn't raised its minimum wage since 2018, and given that anti-poverty experts say this government needs to look at raising the minimum wage so families can keep up with rising inflation and expenses, and given that the UCP could implement gradual changes to wages through inflation indexation to support families while not straining Alberta businesses, is the minister content to keep telling Albertans that everything is not too shabby and that they need to keep struggling to take care of their families?
The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, Alberta offers the lowest provincial income tax rates and the highest basic personal tax exemption in Canada. With no provincial sales tax or health premiums, Albertans, including those on minimum wage, keep more of their hard-earned money in their pockets. And it seems that, well, actually, let me add this. The average hourly wage in Alberta is between $32 and $34 an hour, which is about 10 to 25% higher than the rest of Canada, Mr. Speaker. So it's clear why record numbers of Canadians are choosing to make Alberta their home.
The honourable member.
Well, given that it sounds like the minister is telling Albertans to stop complaining, yet they're still facing the challenges, these families, due to the UCP's inaction on affordability, and given that Albertans pay the second highest premiums in car insurance, some of the highest in utility rates, and one of the highest inflation rates in the country, and given that Albertans deserve more than to not too shabby from this UCP government that cares about building a strong economy for businesses and family, when will the UCP get to work on prioritizing Albertans instead of settling on the bare minimum?
The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, it seems like that not too shabby statement has turned the NDP upside down here. Alberta is doing well. Alberta continues to be the leader in Canada for economic growth, productivity, investment, private sector job creation, and the list goes on. With the lowest income tax rates, the highest basic personal tax exemption, no sales tax, a competitive cost of living, all Albertans, including those making minimum wage, keep more money in their jeans. Again, we are evaluating minimum wage, and we will take the time to consider all factors and potential.
The Honourable Member for Athabasca Barrhead Westlock.
Mr. Speaker, the Government of Alberta is taking significant steps to modernize its access to information and protection of privacy legislation. Privacy is important to Albertans, and the Minister of Technology and Innovation has said it's important to this government as well. Yesterday, the Minister introduced Bill 33, the Protection of Privacy Act. Can the Minister of Technology and Innovation explain how splitting the FOIP Act into two separate pieces of legislation will enhance privacy protections for Albertans and improve the government's ability to adapt to technological advancements?
The Honourable Minister of Technology and Innovation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the fact is that our privacy legislation has not seen meaningful updates in over 20 years, and that means that our privacy legislation predates modern technologies like social media, mobile phones, and yes, even the internet. One of the reasons why this legislation has not been updated in so long is because every time previous governments looked at it, they had to look at both the privacy provisions and the access to information provisions, and getting consensus from everybody involved was really hard, Mr. Speaker. So, by splitting the Act into two acts, we can ensure that as technology continues to evolve, if amendments are required to strengthen privacy protections for Albertans, we can be more nimble and focus exclusively on privacy.
The Honourable Member for Athabasca Barrhead Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for his answer. Given that Alberta's privacy legislation has not seen meaningful updates in over 20 years and predates modern technologies like social media, the internet and mobile phones, and given that every day Albertans interact with government services, and given that Albertans should always expect their privacy to be protected, can the same minister explain how Bill 33 will help deliver the strongest privacy protections in Canada?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the things I'm really excited about with Bill 33, Mr. Speaker, is it makes it law that the government will never sell Albertans' data. No government ever should, and under this legislation, no government ever will. We're also making it mandatory that there is breach notification so that you, as an Albertan, would be notified in the event of a privacy breach that would result in a risk of significant harm. And also, Mr. Speaker, we all know that technology's landscape is moving quickly, and artificial intelligence is a tool that is boosting productivity and automating processes in every industry, including government. Well, we believe that if AI is used to assist in decision-making or predictions that affect you, you should
The Honourable Member for Athabasca Barrhead Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again to the Minister for his answer. Given that Bill 33 is an important part of this government's plan to implement the strongest privacy protections and the strictest penalties for privacy violations in Canada, and further, given that these penalties and protections should give Albertans confidence and trust in how government manages and uses their data. Can the Minister of Technology and Innovation share examples of these penalties and explain how we compare to the rest of the country?
Minister of Technology and Innovation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I can tell you that the next closest jurisdictions are British Columbia and Quebec. While in BC, a fine for an individual would be up to $50,000, and a fine for a corporation would be up to $500,000. In Quebec, an individual would be between $5,000 and $100,000, and in all other cases, $15,000 to $150,000. Well, Mr. Speaker, in Alberta, when it comes to personal information, the fines for an individual will be up to $125,000, and for an organization or a corporation would be up to $750,000. And Mr. Speaker, we're introducing new categories for breaches related to data matching or non-personal information that would be up to $200,000 for an individual and $1 million for a corporation.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Decore has a question to ask.
Mr. Speaker, the average annual growth in nominal weekly earnings for Alberta workers was just 2.3% over the past 5 years since this government came to power, the slowest of any province and significantly below the Canadian average of 3.8%. This is coupled with Alberta's job creation lagging population growth more than in any other province. Will the Minister acknowledge that Alberta is falling behind the rest of the country in both employment growth and wage increases?
The Honourable the Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Alberta's economy is thriving. Under our government's leadership, Alberta has emerged as the economic stronghold of Canada. This is after the NDP did everything that they could to destroy that. But with less than 12% of Canada's population, Alberta punches way above our weight. Over 20% of Canada's non-residential investment is located right here in Alberta. Over 25% of Canada's goods exports. Over 40% of net private sector jobs gained over the last 12 months have been right here.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Decore.
Given that the questions are so specific, and given that 10 years ago, Alberta's average hourly wage for employees was 17% above the national average, given that the average cost of living in Calgary and Edmonton is now 8% higher than the average all major cities, today the province has the lowest wage growth in Canada, with minimum wage frozen since 2018. Can the Minister explain why wages are failing to keep up with the cost of living?
The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I just don't know where they're coming from. Mr. Speaker, our government has worked to bring back and restore the Alberta advantage and our reputation as a world-class investment destination. Major projects like Dow's $11.6 billion petrochemical facility in Fort Saskatchewan, the Lindy $2 billion hydrogen project. These are proof that Alberta is a global investment destination. Through our investment and growth fund alone, we've attracted more than 1,000 permanent full-time jobs, 800 temporary jobs, and capital investment of almost $1 billion just in that one program. Mr. Speaker, we are well on our...
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Decore.
Given Albertans pay the second highest auto insurance rates in the country, which the Minister of Finance has admitted, and given that this government has done nothing to encourage wage growth so people can pay the higher cost of living that the Premier ignores every single day, will this government commit to bring down the cost of living that is burdening Albertans every single day?
The Honourable the Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, during the NDP's time in office, Alberta experienced a staggering 3.5% decrease in real GDP. Now let's couple that with unemployment rates that soared over 8%, which were the highest in the country at the time. Mr. Speaker, the NDP's heavy tax, anti-business, anti-energy policies resulted in Albertans and Alberta businesses packing up and fleeing, and even worse, going out of business. Mr. Speaker, NDP policies not only stifled growth, but it cost tens of billions of dollars in investment, and we're not going to be taking advice from the other side.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert is next.
UCP opened assured income for severely handicapped in 2019, then disabled Albertans lost 4 years of inflation proofing because the UCP de-indexed AISH. Disabled Albertans dropped deeper into poverty. They are 4 times more likely to experience homelessness. They rely on food banks. They face long wait lists for specialized disability supports. Now, the UCP did re-index AISH benefits just before the last election. Better late than never, I say, Mr. Speaker. So, to the Minister, tell Albertans why it was so important to index AISH benefits.
The Honourable the Minister of Seniors, Community and Social Services.
Well, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately the NDP never paid one index rate to AISH the entire time that they were in power, Mr. Speaker. Quite disappointing, and so our side of the House recognized that was a mistake of the NDP to do that and brought in stable indexation, which we're going to continue to have. I had the largest rate increase for AISH this last time around because of what has taken place in inflation in the history of the province, and we will be increasing it by 2%, as the Finance Minister has already said this year, which will take AISH payments up to $1,901, Mr. Speaker, which is almost $1,000 more than Ontario, Mr. Speaker, because we stand with people with disabilities.
Wow. The Honourable Member for St. Albert.
Given Given 1.3 million Albertans are living with a disability, we should all be concerned that the unemployment rate for them is twice what their non-disabled peers are. Given disability-related unemployment, depleted personal and spousal resources, insufficient private disability insurance often means applying for AISH, and given that 77,000 disabled Albertans live on AISH at about $1,900 per month, which amounts to about $10 an hour for a full-time job, to the Minister, with a failure to actually inflation-proof AISH, 2% is not inflation-proofing, what is your government doing to address unemployment of disabled Albertans?
Good question. The Honourable the Minister of Seniors, Community and Social Services.
Again, Mr. Speaker, the NDP, and that member was with the government caucus, did not index AISH. So if she was so passionate about that issue, she should have certainly made sure her government did it. Who did it, though, was the Conservative government, Mr. Speaker, because we know that needs to take place. 2% is right in line with inflation this year, as the Minister of Finance has already explained. That's over $200 million worth of increases to programs that are going to be able to help Albertans, Mr. Speaker, going forward. Significant amount of money. Only the NDP would laugh at a number like that, Mr. Speaker. Again, we have the highest rates in the country. There's some provinces almost $1,000 less than what is taking place in Alberta. We continue to lead the way, and we are not going to stop.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert.
Well, that was a defensive word salad. Given Alberta is one of the last provinces in the country without legislative framework to remove barriers for disabled Albertans so that it can actually participate in all aspects of life, and given disabled Albertans are unemployed and underemployed at alarming rates, living in deep poverty as a result, given the fact that severely disabled Albertans living on AISH earn what amounts to $10 an hour. To the Minister, why is the UCP messing again with AISH benefits by capping possible increases instead of actually indexing to inflation?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I know that this is a really hard thing for the NDP to understand because they struggle with economics and those type of issues. But again, it is indexed. It's indexed by law. It will be indexed this year at 2%, keeping up with inflation, Mr. Speaker. And this government is the only government in Alberta history to do it. So unlike the NDP, who like to sit inside the legislature and complain about things and not fix things, we complain about them. That's the difference between us. And I got to say at this point, Mr. Speaker, it's probably time for the member from Edmonton Strathcona to get back up in the leader's chair and start asking questions, because she was better at it and she was never scared of an election or trying to change things, unfortunately, like what we see with Naheed Ninchie's NDP.
The Honourable Member for Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd first like to start off by acknowledging the hard work from our minister.
Yeah, that's right.
I understand that reworking our healthcare system is complex and it takes time. However, many Albertans are concerned about a perceived lack of tangible improvements. It is my understanding that the move to divide the health system into 4 sections was to better manage and view how it operates. Mr. Speaker, through you to the Minister, can you explain how this restructuring will lead to meaningful outcomes?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On November 8th of last year, we started refocusing our healthcare system to one that works for all Albertans, places patients first in every health decision, and gives frontline experts the ability to provide world-class care. It will prioritize the needs of all Albertans to find a primary care provider, get urgent care without long wait times, have access to best continuing care options, and ensure every Albertan struggling with addiction and mental health mental health challenges has access to treatment and recovery supports. Mr. Speaker, we're working hard to make sure that we have a responsive, effective healthcare system.
The Honourable Member, Fort McMurray Wood, Buffalo.
Thank you to the Minister for that answer. It is given that the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions has been bestowed with all aspects of AHS dedicated to the province's addiction supports, and it's given my understanding is that the Minister now has direct access to information on these services, which was previously obtained through requests. Can the Minister explain what this enhanced visibility means for delivery of addiction services and how it will improve outcomes for those in need?
Minister of Mental Health and Addiction.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you to that member, and of course to all of our frontline staff that are now operating under the established Recovery Alberta. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, before we came into government, there was no Ministry of Mental Health and Addiction, and we have now grown to a full minister with a budget and the work that needs to happen, so we're no longer doing mental health and addiction off the side of our desk with $1.5 billion spent annually for the care of Albertans. My new ministry, along with Recovery Alberta, need to be as connected to the recovery of people through the emergency room as we are in the classroom, which is why this new culture and new lens of doing mental health and addiction care first is so important.
The Honourable Member, Fort McMurray Wood, Buffalo.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for his response. Given that in Fort McMurray, the Tawau Housing Partnership aims to support Indigenous individuals, yet concerns have been raised about the misuse of supportive housing for drug-related activities, and I've even confirmed this with my own municipal officials yesterday. Given that with AHS funding, nurses are at these facilities, it raises the questions about their intended purpose. Could the Minister address these concerns and provide assurances that our housing initiatives will prioritize safety and well-being for all community members?
The Honourable Minister of Mental Health and Addiction.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through to the member for that important question, for bringing it to my attention here in the chamber. The truth is that my ministry, along with every other ministry that work together, have a mandate for recovery-oriented system of care. So I can tell you now, the big heavy lifting needs to happen for us to look at the work being done with the Recovery Alberta, make sure all of those services line up with the government mandate of recovery-oriented care, and I'll be crystal clear as we do that, if there are services that are continuing to encourage drug use over recovery, we're going to have some changes with the alignment of those services and the delivery in the community.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Klein has a question to ask.
In my economically and demographically diverse riding, folks from all walks of life are worried about how they can afford a place to live. We know that Calgary has some of the highest rents and now the lowest minimum wage. So many folks tell me that they are now fearing that they'll lose their homes, and wait lists have grown to the thousands for affordable housing. Will the minister tell us today what steps his government has taken to actually build affordable housing in Calgary? Please be specific.
The Honourable Minister of Seniors, Community and Social Services.
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Speaker. First of all, what we've done is been able to increase capacity by 40% through our Stronger Foundations program. Unfortunately, the NDP saw wait lists go up by 77% when they were in government. So we've done a great job being able to tackle the problems that we inherited from that socialist government going forward. The number one thing I will talk about, though, Mr. Speaker, is the $9 billion investment that is taking place right now in this province when it comes to affordable housing, creating upwards of 82,000 more affordable households, Mr. Speaker, on top of the work that's happening in the free market in this province, which is building the most houses anywhere in the country.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Klein.
Given working people's wages haven't kept pace with skyrocketing home prices and home ownership has become a distant memory, and given that purpose-built rentals can help, but even those require a salary of twice the minimum wage to afford a two-bedroom unit, and given that CMHC Fall Housing Report credits municipal initiatives, not provincial, for increases in housing starts and purpose-built rentals, why has this government failed to build accessible, affordable homes so people can stop couch surfing in their parents' basements and just find a place of their own?
The Honourable Minister of Seniors, Community, Social Services.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this government came up with a plan a year ago to work with our municipalities to reduce red tape that the CMHC refers to in every report as the only bright spot anywhere in Canada. It's why our residential construction industry has doubled its capacity, Mr. Speaker. And most importantly, the honourable member is right. Purpose-built rentals are absolutely critical. For the first time in the history of Alberta, 1/3 of all construction taking place in this province is purpose-built rentals, Mr. Speaker, which is why we remain the only affordable place for housing anywhere in this country, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to work with our great industry to get the job done.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Acadia.
Hopefully we won't get in the way of federal funding. So given that building supply of affordable housing units is critical, but folks need rent relief right now, and given that this government has refused to legislate any sort of protections for renters in terms of rental increases, and given that this government has failed to plan appropriately for population growth and has irresponsibly blamed newcomers for housing pressures, why hasn't the minister committed to increasing the number of rent supplements available so that folks have secure housing this winter?
The Minister of Seniors, Community and Social Services.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have increased rents and supplements to $250 million, Mr. Speaker. That program is working very, very well, and we're going to continue with it. But unlike what the member just said, calling for things like rent control, right after she asked questions asking for us to build more houses, and then stands up in this House and continues to push the NDP's agenda to bring in rent control, which would drive our construction to zero, which would make more people homeless, Mr. Speaker, which would drive up the cost of housing, Mr. Speaker, and would make it impossible for Alberta to go forward. We are not going to do that. We're going to continue to bet on Albertans, and that is why we have the best residential construction industry anywhere.
The Honourable Member for Taber-Warner has a question to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, during the Rural Municipalities of Alberta Convention, Alberta's government announced it is temporarily freezing the total amount rural municipalities are responsible for paying for frontline policing costs served by RCMP under the Provincial Police Service Agreement. This action is a much welcome funding relief to our rural communities, further demonstrating our provincial government's support to rural Alberta. Can the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Services please share why this freeze was needed and why we need the police funding model?
The Honourable the Minister of Public Safety Emergency Services.
Thank you very much.
The Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member, of course, for the question. Of course, Alberta's government is stepping up and are going to support our folks within the municipalities, and especially in rural Alberta. There's a funding increase of 39% that was kind of imposed upon us that we were a little shocked when we heard about this. But we're putting a freeze on it for 1 year. We know that municipalities deserve stability and predictability when it comes to funding. The police funding model, when we put this in place, was able to provide $235 million of investment for policing in rural Alberta for the RCMP, 285 frontline police officers and 244 civilians.
The Honourable Member for Taber, Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for the hard work he's doing. Given the province will carefully consider all factors to ensure we provide an updated funding model that is sustainable, and given the freeze will be in effect for 1 year until March 31st, 2026, can the same minister please explain to this House how much this will cost Alberta's government while the funding model is updated?
Well, the Deputy Premier.
We're going to engage with municipalities, discuss, of course, all the options. So the simple answer to the question, Mr. Speaker, is it's going to cost $27 million. That is what we are going to be saving those municipalities. We knew that that was a figure that would be thrust upon them that certainly wouldn't provide the stability and predictability that we would be hoping that they would have. So we're going to continue to work with municipalities. We're going to consult with them. We're going to do really in-depth engagement with them to make sure that they explore all options to make sure that they have best policing possible for their communities.
The Honourable Member for Taber, Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that municipalities knew the funding model was about to expire, but did not know about the 39% increase in costs with no increase in services by the RCMP, and given that municipalities are unprepared for a jump in policing costs, can the same minister please explain to the House why these costs are increasing?
Deputy Premier.
Well, thank you. That's correct. The member is correct. There were going to be no increase in services and certainly no more officers. And there were several factors. There were inflationary increases on goods and services. But the main reason, Mr. Speaker, for the increase is the negotiated collective agreement with the National Police Federation, including a retroactive pay increase and other settlements due to higher costs from a recent RCMP collective agreements. But, Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear on this side of the House. We're going to do whatever it takes to keep Albertans safe. We're going to work with all municipalities, and we're going to make sure the folks in rural Alberta have the resources they need. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview has a question.
The government this fall moved responsibility for continuing care from the Health Ministry to Seniors and Community Social Services. But instead of expanding wraparound services and supports, Albertans have already seen how the ministry is unable to meet its existing responsibilities. After millions in cuts to special needs assistance, a lack of investment in affordable housing, and long wait lists for many services, chronic issues remain. To the minister, where's the plan for continuing care?
The Honourable Minister of Seniors, Community and Social Services.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you're seeing the plan take place right now, which is unprecedented investments in continuing care, hundreds of millions of dollars coming in for new capital, $1 billion being invested in the transformation to be able to go towards the 4 organizations that the Minister of Health has put forward to be able to bring in true wraparound services and move away from the NDP's approach, which was taking away decision-making power from the front lines, putting it up in ivory towers here in Edmonton, making it so seniors, particularly in the rural Alberta, could not remain in the communities that they built, Mr. Speaker, but instead going forward with our plan, which is to make sure that Albertans could be in the right community, in the right place where they need, receiving the right services.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Given that the UCP UCP cut minimum daily care hours from 1.9 to 0, something no Alberta family called for, and given that families across the province have reached out to my office reporting their loved ones are now facing neglect and a lack of care, and given that operators are cutting the number of staff because they no longer have any minimum hour standards in the legislation. Is this what the Minister of Health had in mind when she indicated she wanted to be flexible for operators, inadequate care for vulnerable seniors?
Yeah. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell you what the Minister of Health had in mind. She wanted us to move our system away from what the NDP had created, which was our elderly and those who we should care for the most, lying in acute care beds, not receiving the appropriate services for their circumstances, lying in hallways and not being cared for, and ending up costing more money for the system, but worst of all, not being in the right spot. She's come forward with a great transformation plan, Mr. Speaker, which includes the work we're doing on continuing care, Mr. Speaker. We're going to make sure that we provide wraparound services for those individuals, and we're going to care for them in the right spot, unlike what the NDP did.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Given that evidence-based research reports the best outcomes for seniors are in public and non-profit continuing care facilities, and given that for-profit facilities focus on profit over care, and given that instead of focusing on these basic standards of care for seniors, this government has chased conspiracies like chemtrails, why has the Premier said they would be Uberizing services further, creating more for-profit services rather than focusing on the models that have the best outcomes for residents of continuing care?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the focus is on the care. That's where it should be. Unlike the NDP, who want to focus on what's business or what's union or what's that, irrelevant for the people that we're going to care for. We want to make sure that they're cared for, and they're cared for fast and appropriately, and not lying in beds that are inappropriate. And that's what the Premier is referring to when she talks about Uberization, about making it efficient for patients and families to get to the care they need. That's the #1 objective of this government, and we will not be fazed by what the NDP say. I know the NDP would like us to go back to the system that they built, which was grandma and grandpa lying in hospital hallways, Mr. Speaker. This government will not do that.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park.
Rural municipalities are still struggling to collect millions of dollars owed to them by oil and gas companies due to failed policies and inaction by the UCP government. Last week, the Minister of Municipal Affairs said the government has made it harder for oil and gas companies that don't behave to transfer wells. That's strange, Mr. Speaker, because in August, the Energy Minister reversed that policy and removed the requirement for industry to pay the property taxes before selling wells. Are the Ministers of Municipal Affairs and Energy not talking to each other?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, we've made regular and great efforts with rural municipalities to help collect the oil and gas taxes. We put in Bill 77, made it possible to sue people. The Energy Minister through the AR has made changes that designed to help. He's now working with the RMA looking for another way to get it done. But at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, the job's not done, and I can assure all Albertans, especially those in rural Alberta, we won't quit till it's done, and we won't be satisfied until rural Alberta municipalities are satisfied.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park.
Mr. Speaker, given that the minister said under his watch rural municipalities go bankrupt all the time, and it's not unusual and not extraordinary, and given that outgoing president of the RMA said it's this government whose policies have made it so financially difficult for municipalities to stay afloat, and given that municipalities deserve a government that will help them get their taxes paid from industry, will this government stop chasing conspiracy theories and actually get to work building rural municipalities, starting with helping them collect taxes that they are owed?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Well, if the honourable member was paying attention, he'd know we're already doing those things. We are working with rural municipalities. We are helping them to get the taxes collected, and we acknowledge that that job's not done yet, Mr. Speaker. We have many programs we work with them to help them build roads and bridges. Our LGFF program was designed by municipalities. It'll provide 13% more funding next year than this year. 3% left the year after because the municipalities themselves asked for that revenue to go up and down with the province's revenue. Mr. Speaker, we have always worked closely with municipalities in rural Alberta. We'll continue to because they matter to Alberta.
The member for Sherwood Park.
Given that the Minister of Municipal Affairs doesn't know what the Minister of Energy is doing in relation to taxes and how it impacts municipalities, and given that under this minister's watch, it's apparently not unusual to see municipalities end up in bankruptcy, and given that the RMA has said that this minister's relationship with rural municipalities has been strained, will any cabinet minister explain to this Assembly how rural municipalities are supposed to have any trust that this government will help deliver services for Albertans?
The Honourable Minister.
Again, the honourable member is not paying attention. I kind of hate to be immodest, Mr. Speaker, but the president of RMA actually described me as an ally this morning in front of about 1,000 of their members. And I'm proud of that, but that's not to say the job's not done, Mr. Speaker. We have a lot more to do. And you know what? As far as the issue of unpaid oil and gas, every company that is not paying their taxes, the IRS should put them out of business sooner rather than later. I got no patience for anybody that doesn't pay their taxes, no matter what industry they're in, whether it's a restaurant, oil and gas, or whatever, and that's what I think should happen.
The Honourable Member for Lac St. Anne Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rural Albertas need a little help when it comes to health care access. We've got large areas, big populations, spread over size. For example, mine's 47,000 residents, about 5,800 square kilometres. Challenges also come to the zones themselves. Some of the rural communities are considered city areas, as we've seen, and that's causing difficulty retaining docs, because we're competing with the big cities, such as we've seen out the Onaway Regional Medical Clinic. Through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Health Minister, what is the Minister doing to improve quality and access in health care, especially in those rural parts of the province?
The Honourable the Minister of Health has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government is taking action to improve access to rural health care in a variety of ways. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we recently announced 2 new grants that will help strengthen primary care in our province. The Rural Team Recruitment Grant will give organizations and clinics the ability to hire additional team members, and the Municipality Supported Clinics Grant will provide municipalities the opportunity to become owners or support clinical operations of an existing primary care clinic in the community. Through these grants and many other things that we're doing, we are enhancing team-based care and ensuring rural clinics can remain operational.
The Honourable Member for Lac St. Anne Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for that answer. There's always a balance between getting access and wait times in the essential service. And given the wait times and access in rural are challenging, and when we do go to the city, sometimes those backlogs are also a difficulty, both with the challenge of the driving, the extensive travel to get there, and then the excess waiting times once we are there. To the Minister, what actions is the Minister taking to reduce these wait times and ensure that rural communities have timely access to the health care system they need and deserve?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for the question. We are working hard to increase timely access for care for rural Albertans. Through the Health Workforce Strategy, we're supporting multiple initiatives to recruit and retain healthcare workers across the province, such as preparing to train over 100 additional physicians per year, both in Lethbridge and in Grand Prairie, so that's one of the initiatives. We're also recently announced a $16 million rural and remote family medicine resident bursary program, physician bursary pilot program to support family medicine residents who are interested in practicing rural or remote regions. This new bursary will lead to more family doctors working in rural areas across the province. I'm hearing great things about it already.
Speaker, and to the Minister again, thanks for the answer. Given many rural Albertans are struggling to access essential health care services due to the ongoing staffing constraints in our medical facilities, given a number of medical professionals who told me that AHS has become a big calcified cash-hungry monster that doesn't listen to the frontline healthcare workers, and given that the patients or frontline workers should be put as job number 1 again when it comes to healthcare, could the Minister tell the Assembly how the government will ensure that rural communities have enough support to access and maintain a high standard of care?
The Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to share the news. We are committed to creating a modern, more responsive and unified healthcare system that prioritizes patients and empowers frontline healthcare professionals. Primary Care Alberta is the new provincial health agency that will oversee and coordinate the delivery of primary health care services right across the province. The immediate priority of the agency is to ensure every Albertan has access to high-quality primary care services, so all Albertans and their families are supported in their day-to-day health needs throughout every stage of life. Mr. Speaker, it's a high priority and we are doing the job.
Honourable members, this concludes the time allotted for oral question period. In 30 seconds or less, we will continue with the remainder of the daily routine.
Really excited.
All fair. Order, order, order. The clerk.
Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Presenting petitions, notices of motions, introduction of bills.
The Honourable the Minister of Tourism and Sport.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to introduce a bill being the All Seasons Resort Act, Bill 35, and it is my honor today to rise and move first reading on that bill. As you know, our government has set a bold and ambitious target of growing Alberta's tourism sector from $10 billion in annual visitor expenditures to $25 billion by 2035, an increase of more than 150%. The development of all-season, year-round resorts on provincial Crown land is key to reaching this goal, as outlined in Alberta's provincial tourism strategy. If passed, this Act will establish a clear and straightforward development process for applications to follow, ensuring projects maintain our province's world-class environmental standards and meet all Indigenous engagement requirements, and will provide a one-window approach to attract investment into our tourism sector. More importantly, these resorts will benefit Albertans, creating jobs, bolstering local economies, and giving Albertans more opportunities to enjoy the beauty of their own backyards. Mr. Speaker, I hereby move first reading of Bill 35, the All-Season Resorts Act. Thank you.
The Honourable the Minister of Tourism and Sport, the Government House Leader, has moved first reading of Bill 35, All Seasons Resort Act. All those in favour of the motion for first reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 35, All Season Resorts Act, is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
Are there tablings? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have tabling today from the Canadian Women in Sport Organization. It's a report that they've written. I certainly won't read the entire report, but the three key messages that are in this in relation to Bill 29 are: this policy is not based on evidence, this policy will significantly harm transgender girls and women, and this policy will not reduce the main barriers girls and women face in sports.
Are there others? The Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday, followed by Edmonton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to table the requisite copies of an Ottawa Citizen article about doctor that the Premier referenced in her remarks in second reading for Bill 26, in which he refers to himself as a right-wing nut and he defends sexual assault. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton South, followed by Cypress Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm tabling 5 copies of an email sent to me and the Premier from my constituent, Frederick Layden. He's very upset about the Premier and UCP government's authoritarian-style leadership and serving special interest groups instead of serving all Albertans on key issues.
For Cypress Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a great honor to rise and table a beautiful poem written by a grade 6 student, Nash Hove, and was read out during the Remembrance Day ceremony today in the Rotunda, titled Enlisted.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood, followed by Edgemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to table many emails. Again, I've got thousands of emails from folks across Alberta. These are 3 emails from parents: Avery Latondra, Natasha Cham, and Marianne King, all parents urging the UCP to withdraw their horrific anti-trans legislation.
Like 4 or 5 extra copies. The Honourable Member for Calgary Edgemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to table 5 copies of a letter from my constituent Tina to the government telling them that her daughter is on the safest path and it has only possible due to pausing testosterone. Tina would like the government to reconsider their bills for the safety of our next generation. As well as I have 5 copies from Amanda, a Hawkwood resident, stating that it's been proven time and time again that denying access to gender-affirming care increases the risk of suicide in young people. Amanda urges the government to resend the bills now and allow trans and gender-diverse people the bodily autonomy they deserve.
You're here.
The Honourable Member, are there other tablings? Did I see the member for Sherwood Park or no? No. Are there others? Seeing none, the clerk.
Tablings to the clerk. I wish to advise the Assembly that the following documents were deposited with the Office of the Clerk. On behalf of Honourable Mr. Horner, President of Treasury Board and Minister of Finance, pursuant to the Conflicts of Interest Act and the Legislative Assembly Act, report of selected payments to the members and former members of the Legislative Assembly and persons directly associated with members of the Legislative Assembly for the year ended March 31, 2024. On behalf of Honourable Minister LaGrange, Minister of Health, pursuant to the Regional Health Authorities Act, Alberta Health Services 2023-24 Annual Report, pursuant to the Health Professions Act, College of Acupuncturists of Alberta 2023-24 Annual Report, College of Hearing Aid Practitioners of Alberta 2023-24 Annual Report, College of Alberta Psychologists 2023-24 Annual Report, College of Midwives of Alberta 2023 Annual Report, College of Alberta Dental Assistants 2023-24 Annual Report, College of Alberta Denturists 2023 Annual Report. Deferred divisions.
Honourable members, that brings us to points of order. And at 2 o'clock, the Government House Leader rose on a point of order.
Withdraw.
I consider this matter dealt with and concluded. Shortly thereafter, at 2 o'clock, the Official Opposition Deputy House Leader rose on a point of order. I'm not sure if there's someone who wants to argue it on his... I consider this matter dealt with and concluded. Orders of the day. Orders du jour.
Government bills and orders for second reading. Bill 28, Meat Inspection Amendment Act 2024. Adjourned debate. Honourable Mr. Sigurdsson.
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture and Irrigation. Are there others wishing to join in the debate? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to rise and to speak to Bill 28, a bill that I am happy to say that I believe both sides of the House can come to an agreement on, and that we'll be able to hopefully move this bill forward quickly. But as much as I appreciate the Minister opposite saying we should just call the question, I have thoughts. And so I'm going to share them first. I don't get an opportunity very often to stand up and talk about rural Alberta and agriculture in the House, so I'm going to take my time to do that now. So again, Mr. Speaker, I do want to recognize that the Bill Inspection Amendment Act is an important piece of legislation. It may not be one that people would recognize or think about as often as I would say some of the other pieces of legislation that we've seen in this House in relation to like the health bills or some of our finance pieces of legislation. But it does speak to the reputation of Alberta. It does speak to the importance of food security in our province, and it does speak to how we engage in our international trade with our trade partners across the world. So I do have some questions and thoughts that, I mean, as we move through debate and through the different phases, I would like the Minister to be able to respond to maybe when we get into Committee of the Whole. And that is just around how we got to a place to have the maximum fines from $10,000 to $100,000. And when I had talked about this and looked into this, I noticed that in other jurisdictions, the fines are quite different than they are even with the changes that the government is currently making. And it is a $100,000 fine and up to a $100,000 fine. So of course it's at the discretion of the judicial system to decide in Alberta what those fines should be, which is fine. But if we look at what happens in Saskatchewan and we look at what happens in Ontario, you'll see that the fines actually are at different levels throughout the different offences. So in Saskatchewan, for example, it's a $75,000 max fine for the first offence. That's an automatic. $100,000 for the second offence. If you're a corporation, these numbers are $100,000 to $200,000 respectively. So there is a very clear definition within Saskatchewan around first and second offenders. In Ontario, first offence only $25,000 for each day actually that the offence occurred. And then $50,000 for each day or part of the day in which the offence occurred. But there's also an imprisonment component for up to 2 years. And this can be combined with the fines, and those fines are $100,000 to $200,000. So Ontario has taken it even a step further They've made sure that there's actually some imprisonment time. And there's also an ability that this can also have other offences that can be found under the Animal Health Act. And so there's other mechanisms in Ontario outside of just this piece of legislation that also can provide penalties. And I think, the minister might be able to address some of that. That probably exists in Alberta, but it's not incorporated jointly into the current legislation. And then I would say that again in BC, the fines are somewhat similar, $25,000 first offense, $50,000 second, but there's also again in BC a imprisonment term, which doesn't exist currently in the legislation in Alberta. And again, the corporate fines are about similar across the jurisdictions, $100,000 to $200,000. So, I mean, again, to the minister, I would be curious why the decision was made to not have an imprisonment component, as we've seen in other jurisdictions, and then why it was $100,000 when we see in other jurisdictions that it's actually quite larger than that. And in our two neighboring provinces, which I think can create somewhat of a conflict. Now, I recognize, and I do think it's important that we know that these fines did need to be increased. I mean, we've had reports now that some of the seizures that have happened have been worth up to like $500,000. So obviously a $10,000 fine when you're able to sell $500,000 worth of meat, it's not really going to hurt your pocketbook, so it's not going to discourage you from changing your behavior and not engaging in this activity. So of course I support the change. And I do think that this needs to be taken seriously. I mean, we've seen recently the E. coli outbreaks that have been happening in different jurisdictions in the province. We know that puts our public health at risk. And so being able to make sure that people are being held accountable when they are putting our public health at risk, I think is important. They're also putting our industries at risk. When we start seeing meat inspections or contaminated meat entering into our food chain, it does start to bring questions up about the viability of the market and whether or not the market and the meat is safe. And of course, we don't want that reputation. We don't want people worrying about whether or not the meat that's being consumed or being sold in Alberta is contaminated. And so it's very important, obviously, that this bill comes forward and that these people are obviously dealt with and the issue is hopefully resolved. There are some other pieces, though, that I think, as we're talking about this conversation, where the minister could be doing and strengthening other areas within our food security system that would ensure that our meat is being kept safe. We know that the U of C does a lot of testing in regards to ensuring livestock health and works with many of our producers, whether they're the poultry producers or our beef producers, to ensure that we don't have a cross-contamination of viruses between animals and humans. And we have seen where things like the avian flu have been transferred from dairy cattle to humans. We also just recently, there was an article that came out this morning, and it didn't happen in Alberta, I mean it happened in Saskatchewan, but where there was some mismanagement around an avian flu outbreak in a turkey facility that in hindsight could have been dealt with much differently. And so I think that, as we have conversations around safe meat, public health, safety, our economy, we're looking at what's happening with our partners in the South and what that could potentially mean for our markets, that we make sure that we're putting all of the mechanisms in place to keep our food safe. And so I've brought this up with the minister in the past, and I'm going to take the opportunity to talk about it again, which is I believe that we need to make sure that the U of C is getting the funding that they need so that they're able to test these different sources to ensure that we don't have contaminated meat. And if we do have contaminated meat, we're able to identify where it's coming from and whether or not it's a risk to human health or if it's a risk to livestock health. And the only way for us to do that is to ensure that we still have the testing facility at the U of C. We know that when we have to ship products to other provinces, like we have had to do in the past, to Saskatchewan, we were even sending but we were sending testing material out to Saskatchewan in 2022 because we didn't have the capacity here in Alberta. So I know that we're building more capacity at the U of C, but they don't have guaranteed funding. And that is a partnership between the feds, and that's a partnership with CFIA, and we recognize that model is funded between Alberta and the feds. But I think we're at a place where we need to recognize that there needs to be long-term consistent funding. This annual year after year negotiation, is it going to happen, is it not going to happen, is not sustainable. And other jurisdictions don't necessarily do it that way. We also fund our treatment areas, and our lab is also funded the least in the whole country. But yet we have the most livestock in the country. We have the most cattle in Alberta than we do in anywhere else. But yet we fund our safeguards, our labs and our testing facilities the least. That doesn't line up. And let's be fair, is like the producers pay a fee to even use that service. So it is shared with producers. And I think producers would rather be able to have that service here in Alberta than to have to send their testing material to other jurisdictions. So that's another consideration when we're talking about, how do we keep our public health and how do we keep our food chain safe, is ensuring that we're using those resources that exist in the province, and we're building capacity and we're expanding on those resources, and we're creating funding and certainty for that. I think the other thing, it's early days, and I recognize that we have a new president-elect in the United States, and the government opposite wants to be hopeful and optimistic, and I would like us to be hopeful and optimistic as well. But I've seen when the current president has been in power in the past what happened to our dairy industry, and I've seen what that has happened with our softwood lumber dispute in the United States. And I think that there is a real concern, and I think it's a valid concern by many economists looking at our agriculture sector in Alberta and Saskatchewan, Manitoba, who are looking at the U.S. administration that's going to be coming into power and are really concerned about what that means for our economy. And we are an export nation. We are highly dependent on those relationships. And we've seen the protectionism that happens in the United States under the current president-elect. And I believe that the minister needs to really look at what that means about planning for our economic growth in Alberta. I think it's time we focus more on diversification. I think it's time that we start doing more value add. And I think that there's an opportunity here looking at, even if we want to talk about the Meat Inspection Amendment Act that we're currently talking about what we do around butchers and whether or not we should be helping with abattoirs, not avatars. Wow, it's like I'm watching a movie. And supporting, young people in learning about how to become butchers, like they've been talking about in doing some of our high schools, and being able to build on more of that value add, and being able to encourage young people, and being able to engage in different aspects of agriculture, and building on, Lethbridge College and building on Olds College and all of that amazing technology and innovation that's happening through our ag post-secondaries, and really look at how it is that we can do more value add here so that we're less dependent on exporting it to the United States. And we're less dependent on having to worry about what if the administration in the South starts to talk about our trade agreements and starts to increase tariffs. We are seeing, as we've talked about in this House as well, about the tariffs that the canola producers are currently facing with China, and the fact that now they're going to have to prove that they go through the whole anti-dumping review and have to defend the industry at the international level, which is just another example of how, if we don't come up with good strategies in being able to do value add in the province, our agriculture producers are the ones that are impacted. We don't necessarily have to export. We could have more crushing facilities in Alberta. We could be doing those things, and it would help drive the economy. It would help deal with public health and food security, which is what this bill is supposed to do. The Meat Inspection Amendment Act does help ensure that we're doing public health and that we're ensuring our meat is safe. But there's many other ways within the jurisdiction to be able to do that, and within agriculture. And so my hope is that as we continue this conversation, we can talk about what is that economic outlook, like what is the potential in our economic outlook. We need to recognize, and like we can get into whether or not the government is happy about the current administration or not. I don't even think we need to talk about it. I think we just need to talk about the reality of, if protectionism starts to come back into play with the United States, what does that mean for us as Albertans? And what does that mean from an economic sense? Remove the party politics out of it, and let's just be realistic about the fact that we have to be very careful, and we have to be very aware, and we have to be prepared for if or when, unfortunately, the president-elect starts to implement his policies, that our economy doesn't get washed out while he does it. I mean, there's an example already in Saskatchewan that one of the Saskatchewan economists was talking about, where there's a crusher for canola that's like 10 miles away from the US border. And if they just move it out of Saskatchewan into the US, they won't have to pay a tariff. They know that tariff's already coming. And so there is a shift, and there is going to be economic penalties, and there is going to be a reality that's going to be hitting our agriculture producers, that if we can get ahead of the potential of what is coming or what we know is probably going to arrive, and figure out the mechanisms and the tools to offset, then we'll be fine and we'll be successful. Or we can wait and say that's alarmist or fear-mongering or whatever words members like to use in the chamber to discuss realities. And we can create a good economic policy that will say, if the US decides to do what they did with dairy, this is what we would do in response. Or if this is what the US decides to do with our canola producers, and this is going to be our response. When our cattle are going back and forth across the border, which they do all of the time, what does that look like? What do we think might happen? We saw this during the drought, right? All of a sudden, feed was going south. The U.S. was putting a ton of money into supporting their agriculture producers, and they were flooding and taking our resources out of Alberta to feed their livestock. It had huge detrimental impacts on our producers. So there is a reality to this, and we've seen it happen. And so I'd like us to have really good, honest conversations as we move through about how do we get prepared and what are our opportunities. Like I said, both sides of the House support this bill. I mean, it's about public health, and it's about keeping meat safe and making sure that we don't have any type of health outbreak, E. coli outbreak, or even a contamination of other food sources or other meat sources. We don't want that to happen, and I think there's a way that we can support this and move this forward through the House quite quickly. But at the same time, I think we can also use it as an opportunity to talk about other opportunities. And let's work collaborative across the House around those economic opportunities so that we can ensure that Alberta's economy is a strong economy. I just think that we have to be honest, and we have to work together when it comes to the potential of what can happen in the next 4 years. And I don't think there's a member in this House that would disagree that some of the protectionist stuff, we were seeing it and it was starting to impact our economy already. But a 30% increase on tariffs for softwood lumber, that's huge. And that's here, that's happening. It's significant. And that's just one example of what we already know. So I just, you know, putting an arm out across the way to the minister to say, or a hand or whatever, to be like, let's work together on it. Let's talk about value add. Let's talk about how do we get more investment. Let's do this in a way where it's really in the best interest of our agriculture economies and our rural economies. Because I think we're going to be in for a little bit of some tough negotiations, will be my polite way of wording it, over the next couple of years. And if we can do that in a way where both sides of the House can write letters together, no different than, you know, talking about what's going on with China with canola. I mean, the reason I wrote the letter was not because of what the minister was doing across the way. It was because we knew the federal government wasn't doing what they needed to do. And so there is opportunities for us to work together to support the federal government in making sure that we're supporting our Alberta economy. So that's all I'll say. That was my little, you know, let's work together and do some good work while we manage what's happening in the South. And with that, I would encourage all members to support this bill. And maybe the minister during Committee of the Whole can just answer some of my questions around how we landed on the fines. Thank you.
Are there others that wish to join in the debate on Bill 28 in second reading? Seeing none, would the minister like to close debate? Honourable members. The Minister of Agriculture and Irrigation has moved second reading of Bill 28, the Meat Inspection Amendment Act 2024. Does the Assembly agree to the motion for second reading? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried.
Bill 28, Meat Inspection Amendment Act 2024 is now read a second time. Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 26, Health Statutes Amendment Act 2024, number 2, adjourn debate, the Honourable Mr. Williams.
Other members wishing to join the debate on Bill 26, the Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to not only speak against this piece of legislation, but to denounce it for the harms it causes to less than 1% of Alberta's population, but who will also feel the pains of this legislation far beyond what is written down in Bill 26, the Health Care Statutes Amendment Act. Because the reality is that this legislation is not only an attack on the rights of a slim number of folks in Alberta, it reflects a reality that is just not happening on the ground here in Alberta. Children are not being forced to undergo any surgeries. No doctors are undertaking any surgeries to minors for gender-affirming care. And legislating this is nothing but fear-mongering and discrimination against the 2S LGBTQIA+ community in Alberta. Since this government announced this discriminatory suite of legislation on the personal freedoms of trans, gender diverse, and two-spirit Albertans earlier this year, I have met with countless trans folks, doctors, teachers, parents, and allies who have shared their deep concern that this government would attack the very freedoms that this government purports to uphold in another piece of legislation it has introduced, but I digress. I wonder, are trans, gender diverse, and two-spirit folks not allowed to participate in being a free person? Are the schools and healthcare professionals that have consent from the parents or the patient to obtain gender-affirming care not free to provide medical services free from incursion from their government? This bill and the suite of bills that attack trans rights in this province would say no. But alas, despite this government's attempts, we are still part of Canada and the Constitution Act of 1982 still applies. Yes, Madam Chair, that means the Charter of Rights and Freedoms still apply in Alberta. I would like to take the time to thank organizations such as Skipping Stone and Egal Canada for upholding the rights of trans, gender diverse, and two-spirit folks in this province, since this government is not. But of course, the UCP would not understand the legal ramifications of laws it creates. We've seen it from the UCP passing its first piece of legislation under its current leader, and we are seeing it now. The UCP's hypocrisy knows no bounds. What we have seen this fall is the following message to Albertans. You are free only so long as you're not transgender, diverse, or two-spirit. Shame, UCP. Shame on this government for legislating hatred and stoking these divisions even further. I think now is a good time for a little story time, don't we think? After all, my people are orators and come from a tradition of storytelling. And yes, Madam Chair, I promise to tie this to the bill. Madam Chair, through you, I ask the members in attendance to practice a bit of humility, because in Cree tradition, storytelling is part of our tradition. Indigenous peoples have had many laws on these lands since before government existed, or even before the regressive Wild Rose members, cloaked as the UCP members, were elected in this House. I've spoken about it a few times, of these laws here and there, and I'm very cautious about doing so, because I too recognize that this is a colonial space. It is not a safe one for my people. It has created many divisive and hurtful policies. As the first two-spirit member of this House has ever seen, I find it my duty and my honor to share this information tied to this bill. On this land that Alberta finds itself situated on, Indigenous peoples had a myriad of governance systems, many of them situated on matrilineality. In other words, our mamas, aunties, and kookums were decision makers for our families, communities, and tribes. These matrilineal societies often found themselves within Nehio culture, whereby these big decisions were made collectively among the women of the nation. Fun fact, I had the honor of emceeing the Indigenous Bar Association conference a few weekends ago on the Enoch Cree Nation, where the concept of matrilineal decision-making came up. What also came up during the panels of criminal law and Indigenous peoples was the importance of having folks on the bench that were able to personally connect with those that appear before them. Meaning, judges better understand the people which appear before them if they can see their own self or their family in the people appearing before them. What really drove this point home to me was speaking to women justices who formed brief connections with the people appearing before them because of their motherly instinct. But empathy is a trait that has been governing these lands long before settlers arrived here, and long before whatever the member for Chestermere-Strathmore tried grasping at the other day in this chamber when it came to progressives or governments. These traits governed everything from health of our people, peace treaties, child welfare, economies, housing, education, land management, and I could go on. But when the missionaries and settlers started to fill these lands with their backward ways, our people's governance systems were weakened. Along with this, our concepts of two-spirit, ayakweo, or Tustawinuak, although relatively new concepts in the English language, were people that were revered on these lands long before the arrival of Christian missionaries. Gender fluid, gender non-conforming, non-binary, trans, and two-spirit folks, gay, lesbian, or bisexual members of our beautiful rainbow family were all natural parts of our community, and in fact took up prominent roles in our society. In some ceremonies, we were even held in such high esteem that we were put above all others because we were seen to be so connected with Creator that we must be put closer to Creator. Madam Chair, I know this bill will show transgender, diverse, and two-spirit folks in this province that they do not matter, and that we are not putting their rights ahead of scoring political points with the most extreme on the right. And I can assure you, Madam Speaker, transgender, diverse, and two-spirit folks are certainly not feeling the love from this government. Would this world not have all of this harmful rhetoric that seeped up from the United States and other parts of this world where the far right have overtaken this conversation about human rights if Indigenous mechanisms were still in place? What a society we could have with a strong matriarchy that still recognized the preeminence of two-spirit folks in a society that did not have any gendered language in the way we communicated with each other. That's right, Madam Chair, Nehiyawian does not contain gendered language. Let that sink in. Our society, our culture does not distinguish speaking with each other in gendered language. This is beautiful. Cree beautifulness. Mio Nehiawian, a concept embodied in some phenomenal works by Nehiyaw legal academic Darcy Lindbergh. One of the first lessons that second-generation survivors of residential schools like myself learned in Nehiawian, I took my classes at the University of Alberta with the amazing Dorothy Thunder. What we were taught was the lack of gender in our pronouns. Nia, wia, kia, nianan. These are all references to self and the people around you that aren't gendered. There's no he, she, they. It is us as people. Dr. James McCocus references this in an article in the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta. For the other side that loves to do this, that's at www.cpsa.ca. If you need help finding that, let me know. I can surely help you out through the chair to the other members. In that same article, he mentions that our fluent speakers sometimes misgender people, even for cisgendered folks, because our language does not translate equally. Could you imagine a world where we would not even be having this conversation? One which the UCP does not hyperfixate on what someone is discussing with their doctor and their parents, or a world where Alberta's government is not hyperfixated on the freedoms of some and not for all. One that they are focused on affordability, housing, and issues that matter to Albertans that they need help with. This is a world I daydream about often because this government makes it so difficult to be a queer person in Alberta. When a gun purports to have more freedoms than a transgender, diverse, or two-spirit person, you know your government has the wrong priorities in place. And where did these priorities come from? Well, let's look what we heard from the Premier in second reading. A few days ago, the Premier referenced Dr. Epen. I tabled an article today in which this same doctor referenced himself as a, quote, right-wing nut, end quote, and defends sexual assault and harassment by the hands of some very illustrious people that have done some major harms in world history. We rely on these experts to create legislation that are not rooted in the realities of what transgender, diverse, and two-spirit folks live in today. And Madam Speaker, if these are professionals by which this government has relied on for this legislation, why has there been no reliance on local professionals? Why were we not talking with professionals that were doing this work, gender-affirming care in this province? I can think of experts like Dr. Chronopoulos or Dr. Wynick, who I've spoken to about this legislative regime, about the proposals from the Premier when she made them, who inform much of my understanding on gender-affirming care in this province. They've taught me that puberty blockers are necessary in cases of precocious puberty. They've also informed me that the regret rate for gender-affirming surgery is under 1%. Meanwhile, the regret rate for knee surgery is up to 30%. I can tell you my own dad had both knees replaced, did not enjoy the process, definitely had a regret in getting that surgery. But yet, when we provide gender-affirming care, that regret rate is not there. Let that sink in. We are not basing this legislation on science. We are basing it on misinformation and fear, on a lack of understanding, on YouTube videos, on TikTok videos, where people gather their information that is incorrect. And that is unfortunate that we are making legislation that relates to affect people so deeply, so intimately, based on these assertions, based on this misinformation. The Premier very intentionally did not refer to any of these experts locally because we know what the science and the facts say about this, that this is life-saving, that us legislating this will harm the transgender, diverse, and two-spirit community. Suicide rates and ideation and attempts go up 70%. whenever we have legislation like this. We've seen the examples. We know what the facts are. We know what the numbers are. We need to do better. This cherry picking of information is dangerous and has no basis in making very real, life-threatening legislation against a small number of folks in this province. I think there's a word for this, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Madam Speaker, I'm thankful that we're having this conversation because I need to put on the record the conversations I'm having with trans, gender diverse, and two-spirit folks in this province. And this legislation purports to do so much. Look how thick it is. There are 4 pages that relate to gender diverse care and the surgeries that physicians are prevented from doing. 4 pages in a booklet of 38. The rest, well, Alberta, you're going to have to read this. We're changing the way healthcare is operating in this province as well in this legislation, at the expense of trans folks, with a smoke and mirrors game, where trans folks are the target. The most vulnerable in our communities are being affected by this piece of legislation. And I am concerned what this will look like when we start losing members of our family, when we start hearing about the pains suffered by trans and gender diverse and two-spirit folks in this province. I urge you, attend the rallies, talk to trans folks, subscribe to the social media pages where we talk about this, because I promise you, this legislation does nothing but hurt. And I fear for those trans kids that are watching today, and I want to tell you, I love you, you matter, and we will not stop fighting to ensure that we build an Alberta where you are seen, where you are heard, and you feel valued. Because that's the Alberta I believe in, that's the Alberta NDP believes in, and we will never stop fighting.
Are there others who wish to join the debate? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm very happy to provide some comments on Bill 26. I just want to thank my colleague from West Henday for framing this situation very, very well and very carefully. We know that there's a lot of consternation amongst not just our transgendered and gender diverse and two-spirit community, but all Albertans in regards to this bill and the intentions of this bill. Because we all live in the same place, Madam Speaker, and we are all experiencing similar circumstances. And so here we are in the fall of 2024, where we, quite frankly, have an affordability crisis here in the province of Alberta. We're facing some of the highest utility bills, and it's difficult for people to put food on the table. Unemployment is the second highest rate in Canada, very, very high here in Edmonton. We haven't seen an affordability crisis and an economic crisis like this in Alberta for probably almost 40 years. And yet, this UCP government comes in with most of their legislation for this fall session around making deliberate attacks on the transgender community, on sexually diverse community, and putting restrictions on people having access to sex ed. I mean, that's their priorities when we are literally sitting in an affordability crisis, where all of us are suffering and we all have mechanisms by which we can alleviate that. But instead, they choose to go after these political things, right, that they know are divisive. They know that they can use in certain targeted ways to try to get votes. That, quite frankly, is not just an inappropriate use of this legislature, but I would suggest that it's a deeply cynical and narrow-minded and irresponsible use of this legislature as well. And for all of those things, I say shame. Shame on the UCP government for bringing these things forward. Shame on targeting vulnerable people here in the province of Alberta, and shame on not doing your job. And so when I go through legislation like this, right, I see that it's a healthcare bill, yes, and the member from West Henday was quite right to point out in passing that this is part of the dismantling of our public healthcare system here with Bill 26 as well. It seems like almost all of the legislation that I see passing my desk here for this fall session, it has one thing in it, but it also has poison pills built into it in other parts of legislation, and in this case, healthcare structures that we need here in the province of Alberta. The bill is so thick because, of course, if it was just like, yeah, we're going to go after transgender people and we're going to, make their life more difficult and not let them to access the health care that they need, that would be just one piece of this bill. But this bill has lots and lots of other elements continuing to dismantle our public health system here in the province of Alberta. They think that maybe people wouldn't notice, right? As if Albertans can't read, as if people can't see the words printed on the page, right? That yes, you are going after transgender, gender diverse and two-spirit people, and you're also going to take apart the healthcare system at the same time, you know? I mean, that's the kind of disjointed and just very deeply cynical kind of legislation that we're seeing here in the fall session. And so again, I can see, there is obviously things that need to be dealt with. In our healthcare system right now, there's 1 million people in the province that don't have access to a family a family doctor. We have wait times for accessing not just those family doctors, but for surgeries and different treatments and so forth that are literally making people sick. We have an education system that is bursting at the seams. We have thousands of students that are not being given the education that they deserve, and a post-secondary system in the same position. And so with all of those things that obviously need to be dealt with, here we are debating limiting rights and discriminating against transgender, gender diverse, and two-spirited people. It's absolutely appalling. I haven't seen this kind of thing for a long time in this legislature, and quite frankly, I can tell you, Madam Speaker, that every time someone tries to do that, they fail, and it comes back to bite them. I know what this government's doing. They're trying to set up these issues for now, and then they'll bring them back during the election, too. And they'll say, oh, y'all, all that we're trying to do is protect your family, and transgender people are going to somehow compromise that, and you got to vote for us, right? Spreading misinformation, spreading hatred, and spreading, obviously, an attack on people's understanding of what this actually is. Some of this legislation doesn't even make any sense. Right? Most of it doesn't, actually. But, for example, there's legislation that would ban, certain kinds of procedures and surgeries on minors. Well, guess what, Madam Speaker? The law already does that. We already do have restrictions on minors receiving certain treatments here in the province of Alberta around transgender issues. They just made that up. It's like we said, we will protect you from people attacking us from outer space. Well, guess what? That doesn't happen anyway. You set up something that's false and then say you're going to fix it somehow, you're going to save people from it, and the whole thing just smells of hypocrisy. We know that there are transgender and gender diverse, two-spirited people here in this province and all across the country and all around the world that need our help. There is an attack, not just here in the province of Alberta, but these guys are not even original enough to create their own new attack on vulnerable people. They're just copying it from somewhere else because they thought it worked politically from other people in other jurisdictions, right? So not even original sort of small-mindedness, but borrowing other people's small-mindedness from other jurisdictions. Wow. Why are we not using or employing science in the pursuit of any of these things, right? Why is the government choosing to override the medical consensus of leading organizations
like the Canadian Psychological Association, the Canadian Pediatric Society, right? And many other institutions across this country and around the world that endorse gender-affirming care. They know that it is a medically necessary procedure and indeed has been going on for a long time. When we ban these things, right, how can we possibly justify forcing families to travel out of province for the medical care that they are currently safely receiving here in this province? Because it's not as though they're just going to say, oh, yes, of course, the Minister of Health knows better than my doctor and myself and my family, right? We'll just conform to this new rule and we won't do anything. No, they will have to go somewhere else to receive that care because it's medically necessary. They're making a choice about these things, and that's what they are free to do right at this moment. Freedom, Madam Speaker, it's an interesting concept. Why is it, or how is it, that the Minister of Health has the audacity to think that she can stand between a family and their choice of how to receive care for themselves and for their loved ones? Absolutely ridiculous and absolutely ironic, considering how this UCP government likes to throw freedom around so speciously and in such a small, sort of limited sort of way. Opposite of freedom, this legislation restricts people's ability to make medical choices for themselves. Why is the government, or how, sorry, does the preventing parents from assessing physician-recommended care for their children line up with this government's supposed commitment to parental rights, right? We see in the other legislation that's also, at least equally ridiculous, right, with this opting in for sex ed in the province of Alberta, right, not opting out, but opting in. They say, well, it's because of the parental rights that they have. Well, guess what? This bill is in direct contradiction to parents' rights. That other legislation is just falsely framed as well, by the way, right? You need to have sex ed as part of a program in public education, and you don't limit the access to it by compelling people to opt themselves in instead of opting out. I mean, that is a deliberate way to block people from actually receiving that information from that other bill. But we're talking about Bill 26 here today. So, again, there's way other better things that we could deal with in terms of the healthcare system here in Alberta in 2024. We have a healthcare crisis around access to service. We have people living regionally without essential care that is available to them in a timely and geographically accessible way. All of these MLAs here today, right, from rural areas or different places, they know better than all of us that there is a limitation and there's a shortage of care in many corners of our province. And instead of dealing with that in a reasonable and honest sort of way, instead we have a government tilting at windmills here, creating problems that don't exist, and literally targeting some of the most vulnerable people we have in our province, transgender, gender diverse, two-spirited community. The member from West Henday is correct. Legislation like this will result in people's deaths. They will result in higher suicide rates, in people requiring self-care, in psychological problems and physical problems too. Lots of them. We know that. It's been statistically and experientially proven in other jurisdictions around the province. So why would we do that? Our job is to respect and to create a secure and safe place for Albertans. And you know what, Madam Speaker? If they do that to one group, what's to stop them from doing it to another, right? Again, I know that some of the members over here are trying to set this up for the next election, where they'll go into certain communities and say, we're just trying to make your family safe, and we're trying to protect them somehow, and spread misinformation and lies about those things in order to get votes in the next election. I can't think of a more cynical way to approach politics here. No wonder people are cynical about politics when people behave like this with legislation like that. It's absolutely shameful. So, obviously, we will push back as we can. It's all a matter of votes in a parliamentary democracy, and certainly we have the largest opposition in Alberta's history, but we don't have quite enough votes to deal with this, which is a problem. Members from the opposite side can perhaps go to the legislature break here for this next week and think about it. To actually talk to their constituents, right, and hear what they have to say, right? They think that people will buy this. They're absolutely wrong, right? If you run this through and say, is it acceptable to target and persecute a small minority of vulnerable people, people will say, no, it's not. They know it's wrong. They do. They know it's wrong. And so I would strongly recommend for all members to take a hard look at these things. Certainly we have been in the last while. We know that there's a lot that needs to be dealt with here in the province of Alberta right now. We know that it's never been less affordable to live here. We know that we have a lot of safety and concerns in the province. We have a lot of accessibility concerns in education and healthcare and all of these other things. This is not one of them, Madam Speaker, and I strongly advise for the government to take 2 steps back, remember what they're here for, and to not just stop producing bills like this, but to start to actually do their job, which is to govern for the people of Alberta. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll be honest here. It is with great sadness here that I rise in this chamber to speak on Bill 26, the Health Statutes Amendment Act. This week has been incredibly heavy, Madam Speaker, not just for members of our caucus, but especially for families of gender-diverse youth who now know that the UCP has no intention of keeping them safe or supporting them. And it's also heavy for millions of other Albertans who continue to see this government not listening to them. Everyone wants their kids to be safe, their families to be close, their schools to be a space where kids can be themselves, feel safe and confident. The UCP is obviously choosing to bully marginalized Albertans as opposed to demonstrating leadership and addressing the number of crises facing this province. Because if they were truly listening, they would be addressing things that Albertans are really concerned about. Having good-paying jobs, stable jobs, affordability, health care, the list is endless. Instead, the Premier and UCP would rather infringe on the autonomy of families, parents, and interfere with the essential decision-making processes within households. Bill 26 prevents minors from accessing gender-affirming care, even if they have consent from their parents and recommendations from doctors. It also restricts hormone therapy for youth under 15. So essentially, this bill will interfere directly with parents' freedoms and rights to make medical decisions for their minor children with their family doctors. And I can tell you, as a parent, this has me livid. The fact that my rights as a parent are being taken away from me. It's unacceptable, quite frankly, Madam Speaker. So while the UCP talks of freedom, of the need to enshrine individual rights through amendments in the Bill of Rights, they're all too happy to turn around and take away those freedoms in order to pander to their special interest groups and for political reasons. Along with Bill 26, 29, and 27, Bill 26 just seems like a means of enshrining legislation that undermines rights of Albertans, of parents, of families, and especially gender-diverse youth. And this is a very challenging time. We all know that puberty and youth have so many challenges that they're already coping with. For the government to infringe on family decision-making in such a personal way is an abomination, in my opinion. It's sad to see that the UCP feels so strongly about bullying kids in this way that they had to address it in 3 different bills, making it incredibly difficult to walk back those policies. So, Madam Speaker, let's call these bills for what they are: prejudicial policies that are targeting a minority group. And I stand here, it is not lost on me that I am the first and only Black woman in this chamber, as a minority and the only one. So it really hits on me to see minority groups being targeted like that. It is a disgrace and a disrespect to all Albertans. And, you know, these are not just my words. They're also words of thousands of medical experts and my constituents and those across the province who see through the UCP's poorly constructed facade. As Director of Friends of Medicare, Chris Galloway stated, quote, "Enacting these new barriers will only serve to put the health and safety of young people at further risk. This legislation will dictate what health care services Albertans can and cannot access. It is an appalling abuse of government power," end quote. As experts have noted, the UCP has introduced what is widely acknowledged to be the harshest anti-transgender legislation in Canada. Again, I ask the members opposite, who asked for this? Everyday Albertans are struggling to pay their rent, buy groceries, keep the lights on, to feel safe, and this is the response they get from the UCP? You know, Mr. Speaker, even as I ask the question, I think it's clear that Bill 26, along with Bills 27 and 29, are being introduced because the Premier's need to pacify her party's radical base. As much as the UCP likes to say otherwise, it is clear they're only interested in serving their political interests at the expense of Albertans. Since Bill 26 specifically places restrictions on gender-affirming care through a healthcare lens, let's take some time to actually discuss challenges Albertans are facing with healthcare. We have 650,000 Albertans, many of them in rural communities, who still don't have a family doctor. We know a lack of accessible community and primary care creates a ripple effect throughout our healthcare system when patients are forced to instead seek care from our already strained emergency departments. And Bill 26 does nothing to address this. Cancer treatments are being delayed, which we saw at the end of 2023 when capacity issues forced hospital staff to postpone some children's chemotherapy treatments. Why not focus on these children who need chemotherapy? Instead, we're talking about trans children and these decisions. How about supporting parents with kids suffering with cancer and needing cancer treatments? Just recently, I had a constituent of mine reach out trying to get care for her father with accelerated carcinoma. And I'm saddened to say that he passed away shortly after our office got involved without ever receiving cancer treatment or even an appointment with an oncologist due to delays and wait time. And instead, this government puts forth Bill 26 to talk about gender-affirming care. We should be looking at care for these youth who are trying to figure out who they are and care for these families. Where are the medical doctors? Why aren't we bringing in the medical doctors who can help families? And now this constituent of mine, she's looking to leave Alberta, saying she has lost faith in our healthcare system here in Alberta and lost complete faith in the UCP government. And is flabbergasted when Bill 26 talks about health care for gender-affirming care and her father couldn't even get an appointment and passed away. I mean, this government is completely off base in what matters to Albertans and instead is pandering to their special interest groups. And essential medical care is taking a hit because while doctors have been calling for help from this province to tackle long wait times in emergency rooms, capacity challenges, staffing shortages, the UCP has done nothing to address these issues. But you know what they're going to do with Bill 26 is target gender diverse youth. Not only does Bill 26 not address our most pertinent healthcare problems, it is there to harm trans kids and two-spirit kids in Alberta. Rather than offer a plan or a timeline to get facilities built, open and staffed, they instead cancel crucial facilities like the South Edmonton Hospital. They're picking fights with gender diverse youth and kids and blocking the freedoms of family and parents to make these decisions with expert medical doctors. It's no wonder our emergency rooms are overrun. Ambulances, their wait times outside, they're waiting outside hospitals. People are being put in care areas that were not designed for it, and patients being sent home who should not be sent home. The UCP is so focused on telling families what they can and can't do with their kids that they're unable to pay attention to the real issues at hand in healthcare. And who's going to pay for this? Albertans. We have dozens of facilities across this province that continue to face repeat temporary closures, especially in rural communities. Just this week, AHS reported service disruptions in Barhead, Cold Lake, Edmonton, Edson, Fairview, Lac-La-Biche, Manning, Rimbey, Rocky Mountain House, Slave Lake, Stettler, Three Hills, Westlock, and that's not even the whole list. But no, Bill 26 must target trans youth and prevent the freedom of families to make these pertinent healthcare decisions. It does nothing to address our actual needs. And to make this list all around more disturbing, over half of Alberta's doctors are currently considering leaving our healthcare system. Why isn't this government focused on getting more doctors, more healthcare professionals in? And what this bill should be saying is the support to help families when you're making decisions for your children, underage, and especially those needing gender-affirming medical care. There is a desperate need for health care workforce plan focused on retention and recruitment, rather than putting their focus where we need it most on stabilizing health care. The UCP is continuing to push forward with their chaotic restructuring privatization plan, which is simply creating more confusion and destruction. They've threatened layoffs, implemented a hiring freeze, created chaos through restructuring our healthcare system. Bill 26 does nothing to address this either. But wait, the UCP is going to target gender-affirming care and families' freedom to make decisions with medical doctors on the needs for their family. As one constituent told me the other day, quote, "You can't say Alberta is calling for years and brag about record population growth, then act surprised when that same growth increases demand on our public services and look at someone else to point the finger at," end quote. We know that these are complex problems and they require complex solutions. So how does it make logical sense that Bill 26 would be considered a priority to introduce in this House when the problems I've listed are not new? We've been going on for years under the UCP's abysmal leadership. To remind the members opposite who supposedly value individual freedom so highly, it is parents who should have the right to make decisions, collaborative decisions, with healthcare professionals about their child. It is parents in consultation with their doctor who should get to say if their child moves forward with hormonal treatment, puberty blockers, and gender-affirming care. Because parents don't don't need the UCP to meddle in personal family decision-making. And for sure, no government knows more or cares more than a parent to protect their own child's well-being. This UCP government has no place in this conversation for trans youth, for family, for parenting, or gender-affirming care. Period. And to be frank, Mr. Speaker, the rate at which the UCP continues to target medical autonomy under the guise of individual freedom is raising flags with many residents in Edmonton South. And today it is the issue of gender-affirming care. Tomorrow, what would it be? Access to vaccinations and reproductive health care? Yes, Mr. Speaker, women in Edmonton South are reaching out to me because they're concerned that Bill 26 will open the door for more pseudoscience, misconceptions, conspiracy theories, and top-down control. They're asking me if they need to be worried about their right to bodily autonomy, including seeking an abortion. What would be next on the chopping block? Because Bill 26 clearly dictates what an individual can and cannot do, what parents are allowed to decide or not with their own body or children's bodies. Let's not mince words here. It is an overreach of power, an underpinning of medical freedoms, and this lays the groundwork for the Premier to implement even more restrictions in the future, depending on the UCP's political agenda of the day. The challenge is that the Premier and this UCP government are fickle and carelessly trying to appease their party's extremist base at any cost. I do not support Bill 26, and it's a darn shame that this UCP government has put this bill forward.
Member, are there any other members wishing to speak? The member from Edmonton, Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to speak to Bill 26. I'm disappointed that I have to rise and have a conversation about Bill 26, but here we are. As many members in this House are aware, I was a social worker before I was elected. And my career focused primarily around working with, at the time, what was referred to as high-risk youth. We don't use that term often anymore. But basically, the youth that I worked with were between the ages of 12, 22 to 22. A lot of them had struggles at home. Many of them didn't live at home. A lot of them lived in group homes or were couch surfing, were gang affiliated, had a lot of involvement in different things happening in the city and sometimes outside of the city. But in part of that, of my journey through my career, was also working with youth that were from the trans community who weren't able to live at home because their parents kicked them out, because their parents didn't understand who they were, and because at times they just didn't feel safe. Now, at that time, there were 2 group homes in the city that were identified as communities that were safe spaces where kids could go and they could live and they could support each other and they could have those relationships. Spent a lot of time with iHuman and a lot of other great organizations in the city that also worked with our youth. And so when I hear this conversation happening and when we start talking about Bill 26, I think about those kids, those young adults actually, many of them, who had more lived experience than I had, even in my years as a social worker. They brought more knowledge to our conversations than I did a good majority of the time. And I think about what happens now. Because when I was with Children's Services, my responsibility was to be the guardian of the kids that I worked with. I had a delegated authority and a responsibility on behalf of the province to make decisions in the best interest of the child that I was working with at the time. And because I worked with youth, and because the youth were living on their own, or they had their own apartments, or they were living in group homes or with family, like friends or whatever that was, my philosophy was, well, they get to have a voice in these conversations and they get to decide. It's their life, it's their body, it's their direction. I'm just here to be a support person in this conversation. And I had the ability to do that because I didn't have legislations that told me that I couldn't do that. And so, you know, when I was a social worker, I took some of my kids to access their reproductive rights and held their hand while they went through having a termination of a pregnancy, or went and made sure that they were able to access their options and have those conversations. I want to know from the government what the policies are going to look like now that this bill is in front of the chamber. Those social workers that are going to be working in children's services, that are supposed to do what's in the best interest of the child, and let's be clear, social workers don't get into this job because they want to tell kids what to do, because they don't listen anyway. They'll tell us how it's supposed to go. But if I was a social worker today, my first question would be, how do I engage in conversations with kids that have a right to choose bodily autonomy and to do what they want to do with their own body? Because that's my job. My job is to ensure that the youth that I'm working with have the right to make those decisions, have the right to engage in those conversations, and tell me, as the person that is working with them and their support person, what direction we're heading and where are we going to go next. And let's be clear, anything that's in this piece of legislation when it comes to health care, I, as a social worker, wasn't the expert in that anyway. Their healthcare professionals are the experts in that, but it's my responsibility as a social worker to make sure that they have access to that information so they can make the choices that make sense for them. And so for the government to bring this in, we've heard from the Minister of Health talking about it. I haven't heard from the Minister of Children's Services telling me what the policies are going to be. What does it mean for kids that are in the system right now, that need that support, that want to engage in this conversation, that have a right to engage in the conversation and to decide their bodily autonomy and the decisions they're going to make for the future of their lives? What are you telling the workers that are working the front line with kids? Are they allowed to have these conversations? Are they going to be reprimanded for doing what's right and working with kids? And being able to be their support person and ensuring that they have access to health care and ensuring that they're doing the work and that youth have the knowledge to make these decisions? Are there going to be policies around that? Because it is a privilege to work with kids when you're a social worker in foster care. It is absolutely a privilege. And the privilege of that is to being able to live their journey with them and support them as they guide themselves through that experience. It's not about me as an adult, because let's be clear, as a social worker, I was their guardian. I could decide yes or no, and I could sign a box, and I could check off consent. I could deny consent. But as a social worker with strong ethics who believes in empowering my clients to do what they feel is in the best interest of themselves, then checking off the boxes wasn't a thing because they were telling me what they needed to do. As long as it didn't put them at risk, I'm here to help. I'm here to support you. Let's find you somewhere to live. Let's support you in living your best life. So what does it look like? What does this mean in practice? For those who are working within the government systems, are you asking, or is the government asking, is the minister asking people who are taking on the role as guardians within children's service to deny kids these conversations? To deny them the right to explore who they truly are? and to not be able to get the health care and information that they deserve to have access to until they leave the system, because that's not acceptable whatsoever. And yet I see through these pieces of legislation this need by this government to deny information to young people to allow them to make the decisions on their own. Kids are pretty smart. Youth who are in the system are way smarter than most of the adults sitting in this room. They have experienced things in their lives. They know things more than many of us would ever know because they've seen it in real life, in real time. And they have a right to be in those conversations. They have a right to be in the room and to be able to make those choices. And they need information to be able to do that. So denying it through education, to deny experts in healthcare the inability to have those conversations so that people can be who they truly are is completely unacceptable. And I am disappointed that the minister hasn't stood up and talked about it. These are kids that are under his responsibility. He ultimately is the guardian, and yet seems to be okay with just removing fundamental human rights. Because that's what this is about. This is about human rights. You don't have to agree. You don't have to disagree. It's really nobody's business. It's fundamentally just about human rights. And kids have the right to human rights. It's built into the legislation. They have the right to a safe home. They have a right to be protected. They have a right to be safe. They have a ton of rights. They have a right to health care. So this legislation goes against the basis of even the Act in itself and what it says around the basics of the rights of the child. And yet, here we are. Minister's not listening to a word I'm saying, which is, a thing. Nobody over there really wants to listen to anything that we say because it's about human rights, and it's a really important conversation. And as long as it doesn't impact the individual sitting on the government side, the government doesn't seem to be all that worried about it. But what I don't understand is why this government is so fixated on removing human rights from the individuals of Alberta, from Albertans. I don't get it. And I've been in this place a long time. And it is becoming more and more frequent that we are having more and more conversations around fundamental human rights in this province that for some reason, because the government personally doesn't agree with it, they decide they're going to take away the rights of the individuals that they don't agree with. And that's not the basis of human rights. How can you have a bill introduced in this place like a week ago that's about the Charter of Rights or whatever it is, and here it is, you have the right to bear arms and you have the right to do this and you have the right to do this, and then the very next day say, but we're going to take away the fundamental rights of trans people and kids. What's the thought process over there about this? I don't get it. I don't get how you can sit in a caucus meeting and just be like, well, this makes sense. Let's introduce a bill on rights, and then let's take away a whole bunch of rights. That must have been a really great meeting. And I really think the government needs to be open and transparent about what it means for the kids that they're guardians of. Because are they just going to keep removing more and more rights away from the kids that live in care? I mean, we've heard the members opposite say that, kids that live in care are just taking advantage of the system and they're too reliant on being part of children's services. So there's a clear bias by the government already about how they feel about kids that are in care, which is completely disrespectful and ignorant to the experiences of what these kids go through. And to hear the disrespect that I've heard from the members opposite in regards to kids in care, the government seems really keen on the babies and the 0 to 5s, the kids that are really cute and they live in care, and foster parents are great and kinship parents are great, and they are. But you know what? Our teenagers are strong, resilient, and they're future leaders, and they're amazing human beings. And they deserve the exact same respect as our 0 to 5s. They deserve more, really, because they've lived through the things. A lot of things. And they deserve a voice. And I haven't heard that voice being provided or given in this chamber by the government. Like, it's like a forgotten conversation, and yet we know statistically they are the kids that are higher rates of suicide. They are the kids that are more likely to be kicked out of their homes. They are the kids that are more likely to live in group homes and more likely to engage in foster care. But we aren't talking about their experiences. And the government has a responsibility as their guardians to do that and to think critically through these pieces of legislation about how it impacts their lives. And they're not. So at some point, are we going to hear what this actually means in practice? Because it's one thing to talk about parents and their relationship and conversations they're going to have with their children. And honestly, I mean, you're removing that conversation too from parents, which also just blows my mind. That's not parental choice or whatever the government likes to say. I mean, parents should have a right to be able to take their kids to a doctor and have a conversation about their health care. And really healthy, strong parents are able to do that and talk about who they are and who their kids are and who they're going to be. So that's part of this conversation, but many of my colleagues have talked about that part. There is a deficit by this government around their responsibility to the kids that they are the guardians of, that they have a responsibility to provide care for. And there's been zero conversation about that. Zero accountability by this government. Zero recognition of the impacts of what it's going to mean for kids that live in a system where their social worker may not be able to take them somewhere to have this conversation. Or if they do, well, I would still do it. I don't even care. I got myself into a lot of trouble when I was a social worker. And I'm fine with that. Because kids have a right to information and they have a right to make a choice.
Member for Sherwood Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the other members who have spoken today on this debate. Bill 26 will move continuing care from the Ministry of Health into the Ministry of Seniors, Community and Social Services. Probably something worth having a great discussion about. But then somehow the government has decided, maybe through all their friends at Take Back Alberta, that they need to bolt on some anti-trans legislation here. And it's unsettling, it's disturbing, and I think we're reaching a point in our history where we should give a great reflection and look deeply at what we are doing to create for the future of this province. I went to speak to a class recently of grade 9s who came to visit as well, and they wanted to talk about what's going on in the legislature, and what that group of grade 9s was most concerned about was anti-trans legislation that could be brought forward. And now it's being brought forward, so we have this opportunity here to debate it. And I'll work to implore my colleagues to reconsider, bring forward Bill 26 again with the administrative requirements that it's going to create for continuing care. But please take out the legislation that is going to harm our children and harm our families in this province. It feels like we're back to where we were with Bill 20, Bill 18, Bill 21 in the spring, where this government is trying to control everything, everywhere, all at once. You know, and not just trying to control municipalities. Now we are going into the exam room with doctors and patients and telling them how they should operate, and we're trying to bring and codify in legislation what doctors can and cannot do with their patients, which is of the best interest for their health. So for preparation for this, I've got a few things. I've got a couple of letters from constituents who have written with their concerns. I sat down with some members of the faith community in my riding of Sherwood Park to understand where they're coming at from with this legislation. And then I've got some own personal experiences with a person who I've known since they were a child, and now they have grown up and they've gone through their own journey of gender affirmation, and it's been a beautiful journey that they've been on. With that, I don't know if this is a good time, but if the members at the other side want to take the air pods out of their ear and stop listening to their YouTube videos, I wonder if any of them want to stand up and just take a stab at how they interpret the difference between sex and gender. All right. We thought we might get into a little bit of dialogue here, but maybe the marching orders are just keep your lips shut tight here. So let me start with some letters from my constituents. Dear Premier, as a lifelong Albertan, I urge you to reconsider your actions stripping away from trans and non-binary children in our province. I find your legislation to be in stark contrast to your changes to the Alberta Bill of Rights. While you've acted to strengthen the bill's commitment to individual freedoms, your changes to healthcare, education, and sport represent government intrusion into the lives of minors and their families. Parents are now forbidden by the government decree from accessing the most appropriate healthcare for their children. I'm disappointed that a self-styled advocate for freedom and bodily autonomy has decided that the state has the power to intrude into the personal healthcare choices of Albertans, and that a champion of parental rights believes that this government and any government in the future can dictate to parents how to raise and support their children. Is Alberta supposed to be the freest place in Canada? Or only the place where you are free to do what the government of the day allows? The hypocrisy of bolstering the Bill of Rights and then stripping away rights from a group of scapegoated children is not lost on me. I hope that you look in your heart and you will see that the justifications ring hollow compared to the harms caused by a government inserting itself into the most private and personal lives of these children and their supportive families. Another letter from a constituent. I'm writing as an Albertan. I want to address your plans to introduce legislation that will remove access to vital health care for my daughter and the gender-diverse community by banning access to numerous forms of affirming health care. They write, here's why I'm opposed to the legislation. It will force my daughter into an even deeper depression along with many other children. It has already opened the gender-diverse community to hatred and harassment. That includes my daughter. It is upsetting a large number of Albertans that possibly supported you in the last election may not in the next. The misleading and incorrect information you have been provided and then sharing is causing more harm than good. Children deserve to be happy and feel safe. By introducing these policies, you will make Alberta a place where safety and happiness will no longer exist for a handful of children who didn't ask for this change. So, Mr. Speaker, when I sat down with some members of the faith community, I was struck. There is a 10-week course that is offered through ministries on what is the best way, what does the Scripture teach on interaction with our trans family and our non-binary family, and it is grace and truth. It is love them, treat them well. And in this province, we must look to ways to protect our community, and we must look to protect our vulnerable communities. And this legislation isn't doing that. It's the opposite of protection. It is massive interference, it is gross overreach by a government, and it is disturbing to have it happening here under our watch. Trust people, trust parents, trust your doctors. This government wants to control everything all at once. They do not trust anyone. They do not trust colleges of professionals to govern themselves. And we've seen they've gone and taken on the College of Teachers and said, teachers, we're going to take on any complaints against professional conduct. And there is a 2-year backlog now on any reports that would have been handled by the ATA within weeks. This government is not good at administration. They are top-down on all things that they take on, and this is going way too far into the personal lives and personal freedoms and what is best for Albertans. We need to get back to basic principles and do unto others as we would want them to do to us. And when you were telling me how I need to get my health care, it is going too far, government. We seem to be at this pivotal moment in Alberta's history, one where we must reflect on the values that guide us as a society and as a province. Bill 26 proposes to amend the Health Professions Act in ways that would significantly restrict health care options for transgender youth. While the intent behind this bill may be driven by a desire to protect children, it could have unintended consequences for the freedom of parents to make informed decisions about their children's well-being and for the medical professionals tasked with providing the best care possible. Today, I want to discuss why this law is harmful, overreach into the personal freedoms of families, the autonomy of doctors, and why it could ultimately hurt vulnerable youth who are already at risk, these stories have been highlighted by other members of this Assembly. At its core, Bill 26 interferes with one of the most fundamental rights we have as individuals, the right to make decisions for our children. The relationship between a parent and a child, one of trust, love, and guidance. Parents, not the government, are best positioned to talk to doctors about a child's health and well-being, especially when it comes to something as personal and sensitive as gender identity and the journey they have gone on through their life and the struggles they have gone on. And I have talked to members of the other side. If there is discomfort with other people, that is one thing. But to be cruel and hateful is beyond understanding. We should be treating each other with grace and love as people go on their own journey of gender affirmation in this province. Under Bill 26, the freedoms of parents and children are being severely restricted if this passes. Parents are often the first to notice changes in their children's behavior and emotional state. They are the ones who understand their child's pain, confusion, and struggles, and who seek to help them through the complex journey of self-discovery. The relationship between parents and doctors is built on trust as well, and shared decision-making. By introducing laws like Bill 26, the government is removing that fundamental autonomy from parents and placing bureaucratic restrictions in its place. Now might be a good time to talk about Nick. And so Nick is someone who I've known since they were preschool. And I've watched this person grow up from a little boy, as I saw them, into a beautiful woman. And their journey has been full of love and support from their family, with careful advice and consideration from their faith community and from the medical community. And it has been the healthiest development I have ever seen in a person. And I'm so sad and afraid that with this Bill 26 legislation, people that have gone on Nick's journey will not have that opportunity in the future after this passes. It is a terrible situation to imagine in our province. Our culture is constantly changing. It's constantly evolving. And our understanding of ourselves and each other is changing. And it should be a more welcoming and loving place where people get to be their most authentic self and live their best lives in our province, because that is the way we will get forward in this society together and build a better province where we know better is always possible. Back to that doctor-patient relationship. For years, the healthcare system in Alberta has been built on the principles that decisions about medical care are best made by parents and their healthcare providers, guided by professional knowledge and ethical considerations. Bill 26 upends this model by limiting the discretion of healthcare professionals, particularly those in the fields of endocrinology, psychiatry, and pediatrics, by prohibiting them from offering treatments like puberty blockers or hormones to youth under certain ages, regardless of the patient's individual circumstances. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you a story of someone who I grew up with, who at age 14, the doctors advised that maybe it was time to have hormone therapy because they weren't reaching puberty. And he has grown into a happy, healthy man that is raising a family and doing all the things in life that he would have maybe been limited from if the doctors did not give the best advice in consultation with the family that it was time for him to have some hormone therapy. Bill 26 will restrict that opportunity in the future. The medical community, including organizations such as Alberta Medical Association, has emphasized the importance of individualized care when it comes to gender-affirming treatments. Many of these treatments have been shown to reduce anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation in transgender youth by helping them align their physical bodies with their gender identity. Gender-affirming care is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It is based on careful considerations of the patient's needs, mental health, and long-term well-being. I had a discussion last night with someone who is responsible for sports in their region, and they discussed intersex people, something I had not even been considering. But if you can imagine someone who has genitalia that presents as female, but they have testes inside them, and that changes them and makes them unique. And they need the best care possible, and they need the best opportunity to participate in our society. Under Bill 26, healthcare providers would be forced to deny care to patients who may benefit from it, or worse, delay care that could alleviate their suffering. Mr. Speaker, I hope we vote against this bill.
Thank you. The member for Edmonton City Centre to speak.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize I only have a brief time before we're going to reach the end of our sitting day. But I wanted to speak to this bill, and I wanted to start by sharing an email I received at my office regarding Bill 26, 27, and 29. Someone writing to the Premier, they say they were here in the gallery of the legislature last Thursday, and they were shaken to see this government's support for these bills. And they wrote to the Premier, wanting to share a personal experience that illustrates why they are fearful of the direction things could go under this heavily politicized legislation that this government is choosing to introduce. I will quote, "On Friday evening, the day after these bills were introduced, I was walking alone on a quiet side street in downtown Edmonton when I had a frightening encounter. 3 men in a truck spotted me and started screaming transphobic slurs. And as they started getting out of their truck, my fight or flight instincts kicked in and I ran. I was left deeply shaken and filed a police report for a hate incident in the morning. This was not an offhand, intolerant remark. For the first time in my life, I felt physically threatened and afraid for my safety because of who I am. This experience has left me wondering about hopefully unintended consequences of the policies you are proposing. I worry some may see these bills as tacit approval to act on harmful beliefs, creating a climate of increased intolerance, hate, and hostility in our province, and making public spaces feel less safe for people like myself. As your constituent, I ask you to reconsider these bills as well as further policy resolutions on similar topics approved at the UCP's AGM over the weekend. Though I recognize we may hold deeply different political beliefs, I believe we all want Alberta to be a place where everyone feels safe and valued. Mr. Speaker, again, I recognize I don't have much time. As I sat and prepared my remarks, I went through the history of where legislation like this began over the last 2 to 3 years, largely in the U.S. and Republican states, driven by heavily politicized groups, looking to inflame culture wars, looking to gain politically off the backs of vulnerable population. That is the roots of this government's legislation that it's bringing in here today. Driven by fear, conspiracies spread by social medias, false accusations that, like this situation, have led to threats on people's lives, have led to increased hatred and violence in communities against gender-diverse individuals. So it breaks my heart to read this email from someone who themselves is not trans. This individual wrote back to me later, to clarify they are not trans. This is someone who someone decided looked trans, and therefore thought they should threaten and harass on the streets of my constituency, and this government is introducing legislation that inflames that hatred. They are spending a full quarter of their legislative capacity this session on bills that endanger the safety of Albertans. Albertans who already face unprecedented levels. And trust me, Mr. Speaker, I'll have much more to say on this bill in the debates to come.
I hesitate to interrupt, but pursuant to Standing Order 4.2, the Assembly stands adjourned, and pursuant to Standing Order 3.6, we stand adjourned until Monday, November 18th, as next week is a constituency week. I hope all members have an enjoyable week with their constituents next week and return refreshed on Monday, November 18th at 1:30.